Yeah. So my point being, and I've got the same issue. I've got one bar at my house inside. And so before Wi-Fi calling, I was hosed. I'd have to like try to find the right place to stand and all this other stuff to make sure I had a reliable call. Now everything works great because it's going over Wi-Fi. So the MNOs are happy to deliver one of their most important services, probably declining in importance, I guess. But anyway, what they said historically was one of their most important services over an untrusted Wi-Fi network. And it's how the majority of my calls are made. Yeah. So
it's not so fucking untrusted,
put paid all of that, really.
It's untrusted until it's advantageous to you to use it. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. You lucky audience get 2 for the price of 1 this week because we're recording this on a Wednesday because our special guest was only around today. So we made the effort and schlepped in. And this is Dave Wright, who's a spectrum policy consultant. Hi, Dave.
Hey, Scott.
Thanks a lot for coming in. I don't think you're American and you live in the States, but you didn't just fly over for this podcast, did you?
Well, it had a lot to do with it. But I'm here for the DISPAN conference. And,
right.
But happy that we can do this.
What does the DISPAN conference do?
DISPAN. It's IEEE Dynamic Spectrum Management Conference.
Right.
So lots of impressive researchers from a lot of higher educational institutions around the world come in and present papers. Industry comes in. Regulators. So David Willis from Ofcom was there yesterday giving a keynote. And lots of presentations of latest and greatest stuff.
That sounds like a pretty important conference for spectrum-y stuff.
Yeah.
So obviously, we'll get onto what we're going to talk about, but it goes without saying that spectrum policy will be a big part of it. Be a bit annoying for you if we just totally blew that topic out.
I'd like to cover it a little bit while I'm here.
We always have a little bit of stream of consciousness stuff that I call opening bollocks to start, just to recap on what we've been up to. So after the last pod, we went and did that Omdia event, which was about AI in
how did that go?
telcos. Yeah, it went really well. I enjoyed it. I was just up there on stage, just talking shit. But the main part was the 3 presenters who are Omdia analysts, Roz and Camille, and I keep forgetting his name. Remember his name? Shit, he's going to listen and hate me. I'll find out in a sec. Kareem, there we are. Thank you. Sorry, Kareem.
I wasn't even involved in organising it.
I know. It's just sometimes names won't stay in my head. It says nothing about the name. It's just a weird little cognitive quirk. And that all went really well. And then we had as a good audience, I thought. I don't know, coming up to about 100 people.
Yep.
Maybe something like that. It's not bad. Just on the top floor of this office.
Nice.
And then they put on some beers after, and we had a good chat with a few people, and then we went out after that. A few more people joined, and a special shout out to Roz, who was on the pod last week, and Ronan, who heads up the telecoms side of things at Omdia, who stayed out till not quite the bitter end, but we knocked it on the head about 9 or 10 or something, didn't we?
Yeah, it's pretty late.
So good skills. I've got to give one more shout out, actually. When I publish this tomorrow, it's going to be my son's 21st birthday.
Oh, wow.
So happy birthday, Jack. I don't think he listens. His girlfriend listens more often than he does, actually.
Wow.
So shout out to Layla if you're listening.
She's into telecom?
I don't know. I think she just sometimes finds it entertaining. Or maybe just a novelty of someone she knows broadcasting something, publishing something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll have to ask you later, Layla. And then on Saturday night, we took him out for a 21st birthday meal, and then afterwards he went, Dad, do you fancy getting a pint? I went, all right then. And then before we knew it, I got home at 2 a.m. So I went out on the lash with my son. So it's a funny old game. I can still remember him being a baby and changing his nappy, and now I'm out on the piss with him in Hitchin. Yeah.
No, so, but the drinking age isn't 21 in the UK, is it?
No. But
18, yeah.
But
16 if you're accompanied by an adult, right? For like wine and beer.
I guess so.
I think maybe at a restaurant you can get away with that.
Yeah, that's 16.
Okay.
No, so it wasn't like a right...
In the US, it's 21, so that's what I was like...
No, it wasn't a coming-of-age thing. It just so happened that, as you can imagine, he'd rather normally go out with his mates or his dad, so it was quite fun, and I got to meet some of his other mates and see what...
That is cool when you get to do that point. Yeah, I was at my oldest son's wedding a little over 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
The reception, he and my youngest son and my daughter, they all had a drink or two. And
and you had a giggle. So talking about a drink or two, in contrast to someone who I know that you know well, who's Phil from HPE, who bought Foster's, you've kind of gone in the other direction. So you brought, I'll show this up to the camera. You brought something called Old Crafty Hen, which, you know, is part of that Old Speckled Hen family of beers. And because you like English ale.
I
apparently.
do. And porters. I couldn't find a porter.
Porter,
so,
I don't share that with you. That's sort of like in the stouty sort of direction, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah,
the
I'm
darker
not so
the
keen.
better. Yeah.
So you like it nice and dark and full flavoured. And they call it Oak Age Strong Ale. And that's because it's 6.5%. So fair play to you there.
Thank you.
Get Phil, if you're listening, he gets much more geezer kudos than you do. Because his beer's about twice as alcoholic as the
We
piss you
still
brought
have some
in.
interesting stuff in there.
You
Well,
We have like
we got some mad stuff. Look.
Phil, I hate to tell you, but there's some left.
That's the one that's going
this
to
one.
remain, I think.
This is was the one Charlie bought.
Probably.
I think so. A friend of ours who came on the pod called Charlie Ashton, he brought this in, and we're never going to drink it.
I think
it's
no.
9.5%.
Oh
I
my
think that's
goodness.
reserved, isn't it, for
Okay.
Howard Jones?
Wow.
That's
Well, I was wondering, should I have brought a single malt, but I didn't think we'd go there. So,
Well, we have got some hard booze.
We've got this that a guy
That's about 50%.
from Exa Infrastructure, CEO of Exa Infrastructure, brought this
Texan whiskey.
53%.
oh my goodness. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's if you
106. Nice.
feel like you need a top up.
Yeah,
Or you need to, light anything on fire.
Yeah.
indeed. That got the ball rolling nice and quickly. That one.
Or UC's licorice liqueur or whatever.
Yeah,
it was.
yeah. So yes, it was through Yussi that we were in touch, wasn't
Yes.
it? So Yussi, if people remember, he was like one of our first pods of the year. We've still got actually some of the Bombay Sapphire that he brought.
Oh,
in.
okay. He brought gin. I thought he brought that weird Finnish liqueur.
No,
I
he
was
was
thinking something.
he
It's
was-
another event I've been at with him.
He was talking about this thing they call long drink. I can't remember what the finish for it is, but it's basically gin and like grapefruit soda sort of thing. It's not bad actually, and they do it on tap there.
I don't like gin or grapefruit. But
All right, so it's
Yeah,
not for
sorry.
you. So yes, thanks Yussi for putting us in touch with Dave, and it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So yeah, apart from those shout outs, I don't think do you have anything to report on in the opening
Work-wise.
bollocks section that we've been up to?
Not really.
No, okay, that's fine. We had,
I don't really do any work.
we had
Scott.
one. Who was it? When we had oh god, his name's slipping my mind as well. This is terrible. I'm showing my age.
A guest on.
Yeah,
I guessed. for sure.
Let's play guest to guest. Is it a man? Does he work for an operator? Does he
God,
work
it
for
was
a
quite
vendor?
recent. It was a really fun one.
Does he have
Does he work
glasses?
for a data
But I
center
just-
company?
Um,
Is it Dag Peak?
There we are, Dag Peak. Sorry, Dag. I mean, you're in good company. I'm
wouldn't
forgetting
you say
everyone's
yes
name.
Or no, when I managed to get
Yeah,
there?
yeah.
That's
He
pretty
reads
good.
your mind.
Yeah, because I couldn't even
that was
remember.
good.
I
That
couldn't
was
even
good.
remember what Elianza does.
You guys are like a married couple. Yeah.
But Dag came on and we had the opening bollocks bit, and we were about to crack on and call it a day. And then I think Pierre brought up the Pope or something, and then we had about a 15-minute tangent of just like the succession or all that sort of
Oh,
thing.
yeah, the
And
conclave.
Dag hilariously went, "Am I on the right podcast?" Because he seemed to have ended up on a sort of Catholic theological podcast instead. But anyway, having said that, I won't look for something to veer off onto, and we'll cut straight to the chase. I mean, it's quite timely you coming on because we, especially Ian, have written a fair bit about Spectrum, and actually our last segment on the one we recorded last Friday was on sort of 6G Spectrum. And in case you haven't heard it, just to briefly summarise it. I mean, a lot of it was just being sceptical about higher frequency spectrum and the utility of it. So I guess an opening question I'd want to throw at you, and you feel free to take this in whichever direction you want, but it's like we hear a lot of things. Like I was just aware of an organisation that I wasn't that familiar with called the Wireless Infrastructure Association. It's American, and they're at an event this week in the States called Connect X. And I haven't muted my phone. And the CEO is called Patrick Halley, and he did this keynote speech. And one of the big parts of his keynote speech, he was just sort of, like all these industry associations is always like making these demands, and everyone just ignores them. But it's sort of their job to make the demands anyway, isn't it? That reminds me of the story that you were saying that you've had some feedback on. So we'll get onto that. Anyway, and one of his big old demands was that that we just need more spectrum. Where's the bit? He goes, yes, we need clear and predictable spectrum pipeline. The 5G success we've achieved so far would not be possible without a significant amount of spectrum, blah, 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 blah. I mean, that begs so many questions because I'd like to know what that fucking 5G success is.
Yeah.
So why don't I use that as the springboard? Why are people like this guy and loads of operators around the world, it happens in Europe, Ian wrote about it, why is everyone always asking for more spectrum, do you reckon?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so it is without a doubt true that spectrum is the lifeblood of wireless, right? You're not doing any wireless technology unless you have access to spectrum. So, okay, start there. But, why do you continue to need more and more of it? And, I haven't, unfortunately, listened to the last podcast. I was traveling last week and this week. But,
I forgive you.
But I did read some of Ian's articles, including the one talking, and I think, he had quotes from a few different people in there talking about, the MNOs probably have, a sufficient amount of mid-band to meet their needs in the foreseeable future between refarming, older 3G bands to 5G and putting bands into use that they've, only purchased at auction in the last few years and still haven't fully deployed, thinking about C-band in the U.S. and 345 in the U.S. in particular. So, why are there the continual calls? And it's not just WIA, it's CTIA in the U.S., it's the European
GSMA,
mobile operators, Etno, GSMA, of course, kind of behind the scenes doing, leading the charge, if you will. Why do they ask for more when I think it's highly unlikely that they need more, or they really think they need more from a technical or a network perspective? Machiavellian me would say, well, it's probably to keep it away from other people.
To hoard it.
If they can control that resource. And I'm not a financial guy, really. Financial analyst, I don't know how to parse people's books, but from what I understand, Spectrum is considered an asset on their books. And they tout that a lot, to the Wall Street types. So,
well, it's the principal barrier to entry. It's why it's one of the main reasons, apart from the cost of rolling out networks, it's one of the main reasons there's such a high barrier to entry to telecoms. Is you got to get hold of this stuff, haven't you?
Sure. I mean, it's it conjures up to my mind images of guys huddled around a card table smoking cigars in a smoky room with glasses of bourbon and. It's a small, tight-knit group, and they're very well funded. So you do a spectrum auction for like a traditional spectrum auction of exclusive use, high-power spectrum. Who's going to show up for that when, it's going to go for, billions of pounds, euros, or dollars?
Yeah, not many people.
It's a handful of companies.
I remember, do you remember, Ian, back when there was the Italian 5G auction?
Yeah.
This would have been...
Well, that was the one that was a bit of an outlier, I think.
Yeah, that was about 2016, 17, something like that. It was when we were in Maple House.
Yeah, because I think all the 5G auctions obviously raised a lot less than...
they went really mental in Italy, didn't they?
Older auctions, because a lot of it's mid-band spectrum, but the high valuation stuff tends to be sub-gigahertz, doesn't it? And if you go up to the...
Although in the US it was...
they spent a fortune on C-band.
They went bonkers.
Yeah.
Which is, what's the frequency for C-band again?
3.7 to 398.
Yeah.
3.7 to 398.
But it's... you look at Europe, and what's tended to happen is that the stuff that's the millimeter wave stuff went for peanuts. I mean, I could have bought it basically, and made about as much use of it as everyone else did. I could have bought it and lost the money that I did spend on it. And then the 700 megahertz, I think, tended to go for quite a lot in those 5G auctions, and the mid band was. It was a reasonable amount. It wasn't like nothing. But the Italians, I think they structured their auction in quite a weird way that sort of artificially inflated the prices of it. They carved out two uneven blocks. They had sort of two blocks that were hardly anything and two blocks that included quite a lot in a market of four telcos, which obviously everybody went for the two blocks where you got quite a bit of spectrum.
Yeah, and bid those up.
And there's a lot of advantage to contiguous spectrum, isn't there? So you get, when it's all split up, you get people getting stressed out about whether they can get.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was all contiguous. Right. They weren't splitting it up because it's TDD, so they weren't. They were selling it as though it was like a contiguous channel, but it was like very uneven. So two companies got
lots.
How much is there in 3.5? I can't remember, but two companies only ended up with a 20 megahertz block. I think, like Wind, Tray, and one of the others.
I think it varies. How much actual size of the amount of spectrum on offer, I think, varies from country to country. I don't think there's a consensus, is there, that
the amount of spectrum
the 3.5 band has this amount no matter where you are in the world.
Like GSMA sort of, it said they needed, 80 to 100 megahertz per operator for 5G. I think that was sort of their talking point. And so that's what a lot of the regulators were trying to do.
The amount of spectrum in the band is the same wherever you are in the world. It's just who's using it, and they might not auction all of it anyway.
Well, just how much of 3.4 to
the rules of physics
3.8
aren't
was made
different
available.
in Latin America.
Well, maybe it's just the naming, because they call them different things. Like in the States, you got the CBRS, which is obviously derived from CB.
No, it's not. Okay, I'm going to correct that right now. I mean,
good.
Phil, if you're out there, I love you. You're a great.
Oh no, so it's
business
Citizens
leader.
Broadband Radio Service versus Citizens Band Radio.
It's not breaker 19.
Is that what Phil said?
Hey, good buddy. Yes,
I'll blame him. I blame him. I'm just passing on the message.
No. So and so I was the policy director at HPE when Phil was there. So I failed. Right. I've obviously failed to. So
you definitely listened to the Phil Mottram pod, then?
Well, I did. That was great. Yeah. No, Phil's great. He's a tremendous leader. But no, it's nothing to do with CB radio. It is Citizens Broadband Radio Service in the U.S., which is all about really creating more opportunities for people to play in cellular technologies beyond just the big mobile operators.
Right. So the whole concept of it, that's why they call it Citizens, is for it to be more readily accessible to
Yeah,
whoever.
I mean, the FCC called it the innovation band, right? They wanted to create a band where people could come in and deploy LTE and 5G, who weren't AT&T, T-Mobile, or Verizon.
It's quite similar to what some European countries, Germany's the notable one, where they kept about 100 megahertz.
3.7 to 3.8.
Yeah. And said that's going to be for industrial companies, like
Siemens and Bosch.
So the only thing to you, I'm sure you're right to correct me, and the only reason I get confused, I think it's probably more to do with nomenclature than it is whatever the international consensus is. They get given different names, and I sometimes get confused.
Yeah, they do get given different names.
Yeah.
Like mid-band,
mid-band is a wacky definition.
It's a wacky definition. I think in the States, mid-band doesn't mean 3.5 gigahertz. It tends to sort of refer to lower stuff, doesn't it, than that?
Well, it shifts around to suit whoever is trying to...
I even noticed when the Vodafone 3 merger stuff was going on last year and the competition authorities were looking at that, their definition of mid-band was spectrum between 1400 and 2.6, which is not generally how Europe refers to mid-band. Europe refers to mid-band to mean that 3.5 gigahertz stuff that you've used for 5. So it's all very confusing, I think. But
I think you have to kind of define your terms before you start throwing them around, and it irritates me to no end that I'll just say it. CTIA, they have. They love to talk about how we're losing the race to 5G. We were losing the race to 5G. Now we're going to lose the race to 6G. We keep racing. I'm very tired.
I'm not sure there is a race.
Yeah, and I'm not sure you want to win it either. But
But that a lot of that. Sorry, you carry on. I've got.
I was just going to say on this. So one thing recently is like they've been talking about. The U.S. has a big mid-band deficit compared to China, right?
That's kind of what I was about to lead up to.
But
and it's just as a form of political rhetoric. Especially now, and we might get onto more of that in a bit. It's just such an easy thing. If you're trying to get the US government to play ball, all you need to do is go, well, if you don't help us out, the China's going to win.
Do you mean deficit in terms of like not enough rolled out equipment?
Well, just not enough allocated, right? Not enough available, right? So, and they've got, this chart. And again, kind of coming back to what is your definition of mid-band, right? And so it starts at 3, if I remember correctly. And, so that automatically excludes like 240, 260, I forget. T-Mobile has like 2.6 gig spectrum, and they just conveniently ignore that, right? So take that off of the table. We'll just start at 3 because that's makes our case better for us. And then in China, they include like 3.3 to 3.4, which is an indoor-only sort of lower power, and it's split between China Telecom and China Unicom. They're using it for essentially managed business networks, if you will. So it's not a macro 5G network by any stretch, 3.3 to 3.4 in China. They include a big portion of 6 gigahertz there, which China has said they plan to use IMT in there, but they haven't done anything with it yet. So there's all these like huge caveats around.
Well, I mean, the funny thing about spectrum, by definition, is that it's a gradient. And so creating hard boundaries are always going to be artificial.
That's why you need to define them. That's what I'm saying. Like when I say mid-band, I'll say, okay, and I mean 2 to 8 gigahertz or whatever.
Exactly. And it's interesting because like back in the sort of 3G era, I remember writing when I was really first just getting to know this industry. I remember writing about the advantage that EE got in the UK because it was able to refarm, I think, some 1800 megahertz spectrum. And that gave it a real head start in 4G for reasons I can't remember the details of. But basically, it was able to recycle a big chunk of spectrum that it had and its competitors didn't have. So there was lots of moaning from them that Ofcom allowed that. And about 1800s, quite high. And I think there were some, even back in 3G, there was some at about 2.1 gig, if I remember rightly.
3G is 2 gigahertz, 2.1.
Right, there we go.
But that's good. I mean, one of the big differences that, so I understand, between like T-Mobile US and the other two big US carriers is partly the low band stuff that they've done with 600 just to get coverage. But if you talk to people like Lummy, they'll say, well, that's not really 5G. It's just,
I agree.
It's just,
I know he was saying, it shouldn't have included low band in 5G.
Yeah, and I thought that was an interesting point because it gets to this, the technology itself isn't improving that much. You're just pushing it into higher bands, really, into the actual standard itself isn't. But the other thing that T-Mobile's done is this Sprint spectrum that was at 2.5, which is quite a bit different in terms of propagation.
Even from 3.5.
From 3.5.
Exactly.
So your 1800 is actually pretty good spectrum.
Yeah. But just to correct me, and then I'll cede the floor. Am I correct in assuming that there's basically a gradient, a directly proportional gradient where the higher the frequency, the poorer the propagation, and it's just simple as that?
Yeah, it's physics.
So the lower the number, the better the frequency for the purpose of radio.
Well, there are trade-offs, right? So yes, and propagation-wise, absolutely. The higher frequency you go, the worse propagation you're going to have. The worse range you're going to have, but the more capacity you're going to have. On the other hand, right?
But only if there's more of it. Yeah.
Well, but there tends to be a lot more.
There is more as you go up.
There is more, but what I'm saying is it's not intrinsic. So when people talk about 5G as if that's somehow intrinsically higher bandwidth, it's not. It's just that it's associated with the higher frequencies, which there's more of. And one of the reasons there's more of it is because it's shitter.
It wasn't usable previously.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so back in the voice-only days, nobody gave, you didn't need more than 5 or 10 megahertz a carrier probably to carry voice.
Yes, because you weren't beaming data, video.
Right.
So the question you want to ask is if you put 5G in the same spectrum band that's been used for 4G,
is it any better?
And I think people are like, probably not, especially the non-standalone version.
Yeah, and that gets to this whole, when we get 6G, if you were to take 6G and refarm those bands that are now used for 4G and 5G, which I really don't see happening, although I know this, I've written about this and had some pushback on it, but if you were to refarm those bands and put 6G in it, would it really be worth it? Would it really be worth it replacing stuff and putting 6G in those bands and getting... would you get any kind of improvement at all? We don't know because it's not here yet, I suppose. But
well, I mean, I'm going back to the piece you wrote a while ago about the next gen mobile alliance or networks or whatever they're called, and their whole point was, hey, we don't want to invest in a whole new RAN refresh for 6G, right? We potentially want to carry our 5G RAN or 5G Advanced or Pro or whatever they're calling it assets into the 6G realm and, just do software upgrades around the core and whatever. Yeah. It's like, okay, well, if that's the case, then why are you saying now you need 6 gigahertz to make 6G?
Yeah, to me, it's a massive, and I've had some pushback on that point that there's not really an inherent contradiction there. I don't see how that, I mean, the way you just put it, it's a contradiction. You can't say we don't want to do a big RAN refresh and we want it to be software upgradable and then say
but we need the spectrum or it doesn't work.
And I think in the letter that was written that we talked about a little bit maybe last week.
We might as well go on to that. Let me just quickly tee it up. This was your headline writing about it was telcos guilty of 6G mixed messages and falsehoods.
Yeah. And the amount they're asking for, by the way, just to sort of finish what I was saying, is that I think it's about 700 megahertz available in that upper 6. It goes from about 6.4 to 7.1. So it's about 700 megahertz. They said this in the letter. They said we need at least 600 megahertz. Otherwise, there'll be capacity problems. I mean, that's paraphrasing, but that's pretty much what they said. I mean, that's how can those two things not be a contradiction?
So that kind of goes full circle.
I think that's a great question.
Back to my opening question about that I posed to you, Dave, about why they're asking for more and more. The sort of the few minutes that we've spent going off on a few tangents since then, we're posing a lot of sort of sub questions within that. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I gather, and I'll ask you, Ian, what kind of feedback you got on that piece. But you were just telling us before we started recording that you'd had some robust feedback on the matter. But it does seem like bollocks to me. Firstly, from what Ian just said about this contradiction between it being a software upgrade versus a massive technological overhaul, and then the second one being, what we've just been talking about the utility of this spectrum all the way up in the 6 gigahertz area.
Right.
So, when you read that story that Ian wrote, yeah,
I did.
Did you? What did you think of that? Did you agree with the premise?
I agree with
of
his
it?
analysis. I thought it was spot on. I mean, I looked at the letter that those MNOs sent, and I thought it was just yet another plea for we want more exclusive use high power spectrum, which is always the story.
Yeah.
I don't think they've ever seen a megahertz of spectrum that they didn't think should be exclusive high power use.
Yes.
Why are
so
they?
they'll argue with the Wi-Fi industry as well, won't they?
Well, that's what's going on, right? On Upper 6. The U.S., Canada, and South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and a number of other countries have allocated the full 1,200 megahertz to license exempt or unlicensed uses Wi-Fi.
Right.
And then, Europe and a lot of Asia have only allocated the lower 500 megahertz or 480 with a little guard band at the bottom, and have said, hey, we'll sort out what we're going to do with the 700 megahertz as a next step, and that's the battle that's being fought now.
So actually picking up on your initial response to my question about how, to a certain degree, it's sort of hoarding it to keep it out of other people's hands, are you familiar with a term they use in business called a moat? I just heard about it. I heard it before, but I was listening. There's one podcast I listened to. It's something called the All In podcast, and it's got a bunch of American Silicon Valley types. And it can sometimes be a bit annoying. There's a group of them. They play poker together. That's why it's called the All In podcast. And they're used to talking over each other. They're all these very alpha, very successful billionaire investor types. Okay. So they're used to sort of dominating the room. And then among all of them, they can get quite squabbly. It can be entertaining. It can sometimes be annoying. But they were talking about a moat. I think it's a chap called Jason Calacanis. And a moat is basically, and that's what all entrepreneurs want. They want a moat, and a moat is basically something that protects your bit of business from competition. So it could be lots of reasons. It could be a network effect, for example, something like YouTube. No one's ever really been able to compete with YouTube because it has such a critical mass of user base.
Yeah.
So that could be one moat. It could be something else. And in telecoms, one of those moats will be spectrum availability. So it occurs to me another reason they're always asking for it is because they don't want people using this unlicensed spectrum and coming up with wireless services that basically directly compete with them. I mean, they're not going to directly compete in so much as they're going to create a whole new MNO necessarily, but then people might use these services that are used over unlicensed, such as anything to do with Wi-Fi for starters. I mean, if you think of like international calls, a couple of generations ago, international telephony was an incredibly lucrative business. Mm-hmm. Now we just do a WhatsApp call over the internet, and it costs us fuck all.
Yeah.
So I guess that's another thing to pick up on what you're saying is they it's part of this moat concept that if they stop other people owning the spectrum, then that just the ownership of the spectrum alone makes that moat.
I'm sort of interested in because we hear all these arguments from the telcos about why they need the spectrum and it's going to be a disaster and you're all going to be without mobile services in the future.
You'll lose the race too.
Yeah, you're all going to be in digital darkness and all this, and it's going to be everybody's going to live in log cabins and eat each other.
And China will take over. But I never really hear, probably because I don't cover it enough, what the Wi-Fi community says about like this upper 6 gigahertz band, for instance.
Yeah.
I've seen all these telco letters, and I've been at press conferences for years hearing CTOs going on about, we have Wi-Fi businesses as well, and we can tell you.
Well, that was in the letter. We if you want to know about Wi-Fi, we're the ones who are doing it.
So what is it? How does the Wi-Fi industry kind of counter this? And is there? I think we talked about this before we came on, but is there on that whole, how much money gets spent on spectrum? It's very lucrative for governments when companies are spending billions and billions. We just talked about Italy. Is that a factor in what's going on here? Because it's unlicensed, you're not really generating that kind of income from it.
Definitely. Wow. Okay. So between the two of you, there's like three things I want to talk about simultaneously.
I think we should shut up for a bit.
Okay. So I'm saying
that to myself mainly.
I'm going to.
Hold on. Having said that, I'm going to interrupt you. Do you want to try one of the shipyards that
Yes,
Dave
please.
brought in?
If that's okay.
So,
Great.
Quick interruption. Before I formally shut up, you also brought us in this stuff that's from, I don't think you brought it from the States.
I did not.
Unlike this, which we've got to talk about. I might as well get all the interruptions out of the way, and then I'll properly put a zip on my mouth. So you brought this, and it's from Portland, Maine, USA. It's called Shipyard, American IPA. Pioneers of true refreshment and taste, they are. And so I think we're going to have some of that now, Ian.
Yeah.
Luckily, I'm such an alcoholic that I keep a bottle opener on my keyring. There you go.
Thank you.
I might as well cue one up for myself.
And you were going to say there's also
and
some
I was
very
going to
nice
say,
toffee.
I'll show you the camera
Toffee,
this. So you
but,
did bring this from the States.
Those are
I
for
did.
me.
I did bring that.
Pierre's
already
bags
bags them. Chapel Hill toffee, pecan and dark chocolate. Should we try a bit now?
Well, I think he wants to say that home.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can try it now.
So I wanted to bring.
You're not taking it home.
I wanted to bring something
We're gonna share it.
from North Carolina, where I'm from, right? And the options were, barbecue, which is really hard to bring on an airplane. The other thing is, like, we're famous for our peppers. The Carolina Reaper, which is like one of the hottest peppers like in the world, is off the Scoville. But I was like, I probably don't want to bring you guys like hot sauce with Carolina Reapers because you probably wouldn't be my friends anymore. So.
Well, we might
Sure.
struggle to
Thank
actually
you.
speak during the rest of the podcast.
Well, I'll tell you what. Pierre, have one. If you're really good, we'll let you take the rest home. You're going to have it after. So that's what this is, Chapel Hill Toffee. Thanks a lot, Dave. So, yes, I think that's the interruptions out of the way. I just thought I'd like to give credit when our guests bring stuff in for us.
Thank you.
So, yes, you were about to answer a bunch of stuff that we've been banging on about.
I want to loop back to your thing about the moat.
Yeah.
So you were saying this All In podcast. They kind of described it as entrepreneurs want to have a moat around whatever they're up to, which I completely understand. I think what I'm concerned about is when an incumbent industry, with very deep pockets, very politically connected industry, says we want to put a moat around Spectrum because it is, again, what makes wireless work. Without it, you can't do anything. And they can directly thwart disruption, innovation, anything happening to their business model if they can control that asset. So that's what I think is more the concern there. And,
Makes sense.
And I mean, you were talking about IP telephony or long distance and everything else, and
Yeah.
I've been around a while, and to me, it's sort of just the same story playing out over and over again. It's back in the day, I can remember IBM mainframes, right? Everybody had their mainframe and big data center, and not even a data center. It was just called a mainframe room or a server room or whatever. You have your 3270 terminals out around your office space, and you'd have controllers that all had these SDLC connections to the terminals, and all this SDLC SNA stuff was going over those links. So there's this parallel thing. And then at some point in time, people had deployed, IP networks, and we were running other protocols too, but IP. And people said, "Hey, can't we probably carry that IBM traffic over IP as well?" And so within a
Totally disruptive.
couple of generations of technology, that all went away. Like IBM's networking business just went poof,
Right.
And Cisco largely subsumed all of that.
Right.
Voice, I saw the same thing happen, especially initially with long distance, not even just international, but even domestic long distance in the U.S. Everybody used to have dedicated, DS1s or DS3s for voice traffic between their facilities and and then nope, we'll just do IP over frame relay or IP over whatever, WAN connection that we have for our voice traffic. And then it happened in the campus, right? I mean, think about, wired phones. I mean, in the old days, everybody had a PBX on their campus, and you had I was a network administrator, so I was running the IP network and the Novell network back in the day. And, next to me was like the PBX staff, right? And all they did was like assign people numbers and take care of updates to the PBX and, whatever, outbound connections we had. And then Cisco, again, I think they bought Celsius was the name of the company in 2000 and I think it's 2000, 99, 2000.
So that was when Cisco, in terms of share price, was at its peak.
It was right
a
around
real
then.
dot-com bubble boomer, wasn't it, Cisco?
It was April of 2000 because I was an employee at the time.
Ah, right.
Yes. So
Did you have any stock at the time?
I had a little bit.
Well, I hope you sold it at the right moment.
Not quite. I
Not
feel
quite.
okay about my exit point, but it wasn't the top.
Right. So it wasn't. It wasn't 2003 at least.
No,
Yeah.
no, it was not then. But anyhow, I mean, so the point being that that all went to IP as well. So even wired, so there's that whole generation of wired telephones, wired IP phones, right? So you'd have an IP phone, and instead of a PBX, a piece of hardware, you now have a call manager, which is just software running on a server, right? That does all of your PBX stuff, and so again, subsumed into all of that, and I just see the same thing eventually happening here. That you've got this very closed, proprietary, arcane, complex ecosystem that's developed around mobile. And then you've got, open systems that have kind of evolved more out of the internet model. And I think Wi-Fi is sort of just an extension of the internet in a lot of ways. And what's going on with private cellular is a whole other sort of,
Yeah, Wi-Fi is just a wireless way of accessing the internet for most people.
Largely, yeah. That's the way most people use it, right? And then private LTE, private 5G, which again is, probably a lot of the current use cases are around industrial uses. Where those ROIs are pretty evident, and shipyards and logistics hubs and airports and things like this are deploying private cellular solutions for that. But all this innovation, all this disruption's happening, and I think to a certain extent, the incumbents are like, hey, we kind of like being our tight-knit, cozy club here, and we'd rather not have Pandora's box opened.
But wasn't Pandora's box opened decades ago? We've spoken about it recently in the podcast, and it's an ongoing, almost sort of cliche within the telecoms industry, where they used to talk about OTTs, over the top players. And it was meant as a sort of, as a bit of a complaint, a bit of a pejorative.
Right.
Because they're like, we've gone to all the trouble of making these fucking networks.
Yeah.
And now these bastard big tech
are using them.
yank companies.
Making it to be freeloaders.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So in that respect, so are you, like with what you were just saying now, are you inferring like another phase and the next phase of that kind of process?
Well, I mean, I'm so a nerd. Is that the right word? I don't even pay attention anymore to the pejoratives because there's so many of them. So OTT and 3GPP speak is just it's Orwellian as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But they don't have private networks. We have non-public networks.
Right.
And Wi-Fi was an untrusted thing for quite a while. I mean, all these terms that get defined, which sort of
they probably still use that now, though, don't they? They make this point that it's because it's unlicensed, it's subject to interference, and it's not reliable, and you'd never want to put critical stuff on it. But
yeah, I mean, you're right. They'll say all of those things, and they'll say the same things.
I'm
even
not saying
about,
I agree with it, by the way.
They'll even say the same things about private cellular deployments, right? Because like now there's a whole move to. That's where I've taken us to too many. I've got to circle back to your other topics before too long, but
so we do this to people.
That's okay. I probably have too much to say, but no, I was just going to say. So a big thing now is you can deploy a private LTE or a private 5G network, and in the U.S. it would be with the CBRS 3.5 spectrum. Here in the UK it would be with the 3.8 shared access licenses that Ofcom's made available.
Yeah.
And so you could do that as a private, so internal communications, again, industrial, but also it could be just office. I want to do something which requires a little bit more range, or I have some mobility things that Wi-Fi really doesn't deal with great, then, hey, do it with cellular. But it's like, okay, now I've got that, and I haven't even checked my phone here, but I understand your cell service here is not great.
No, it's not. I get on the guest. I get on the guest Wi-Fi with my phone when I'm in.
Yeah. So if somebody were to deploy one of these private, cellular systems in the building here, and you were using it for, whatever you want to, building control systems and but then you say, hey, why not support the EE and the Vodafone and whatever other MNOs, BT, I guess, let's support their subscribers in the building through a neutral host type of an arrangement, right?
We've had that chat in the pod before.
That's happening now.
Yeah.
That's happening in the U.S. with CBRS in particular. So, a few of the MNOs have gotten on board with that. And, so hospitals and some of the retailers now, have deployed private solutions, but they're using it also as a neutral host in building cellular. But to your point, we'll hear the same arguments. Oh, do I want to have my subscribers on this network that I didn't deploy?
Yeah.
Somebody else deployed it. How comfortable am I with it? And so there's all the conversations about KPIs and that. I think that's all a bit overblown. I mean, I think they use that conveniently when they want to be obstructionist. And the thing that I really think makes the point crystal clear is I would have to connect to your Wi-Fi. You're on Wi-Fi?
Yeah.
But you have Android, right?
I've got an Android, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
I don't know how to check on.
I can get you on the Wi-Fi quickly now if you want.
Okay, I was just going to say,
make a point.
and I don't know, I'm roaming, so it'll be interesting to see. But you're on the Wi-Fi network?
He's got an iPhone.
Right.
I am on Wi-Fi, yeah.
Okay. Does it say Wi-Fi call? Like if you swipe down from the top and you get the detail?
Wi-Fi call.
Yeah. Okay, so you're using
yeah.
Wi-Fi calling.
Yeah.
So that's my point. Okay, so if you place a voice call, right now it's not going over the 5G.
In fact, I think most of my voice
4G.
calls go over Wi-Fi
Right.
because they're usually at home with me sitting in my little cubby hole.
Yeah. So for the longest time, voice was sort of the service, right? And so that was the thing that, they can't have bad calls and, we've got to make sure our subscribers are happy. If they get a bad, connection, they're going to call us, and then a little company in North Carolina, actually, run by some friends of mine, came up with this new service, Republic Wireless. This was 2011 timeframe, if I remember correctly. And they were the first ones who put out a phone that did essentially voice over IP and over Wi-Fi, right? So, I mean, it would revert to the cellular network if there wasn't, if you didn't have a Wi-Fi connection. But anytime you're on Wi-Fi, your voice went over Wi-Fi. And that started the ball rolling. And within 5 or 6 years, all of the carriers were supporting Wi-Fi calling.
So those guys, just out of a sort of business interest, those guys that did that, do they make money from the sort of IP that's in that, or is it?
That's a good question.
I'm always
They
interested.
ended up selling that to Republic. Got sold to, was it Dish?
Right.
I'll have to go back and look, but it was something like that.
Just curious how, because obviously someone's worked on doing, like these guys, they've worked on doing something like this, but you always assume from a consumer angle or even an industry angle, you're always thinking, there's no money in this, is there? Because
I would
Well, the guy,
passing,
the founder, again, I know the guy who runs that company, and he was just frustrated at how much he was having to pay for cellular service for all of his kids. He's got like 7 kids.
I think anybody in London, the frustration is that you're indoors, you just don't get a very good cell service.
Well,
and I remember when voice over Wi-Fi first came along, it was like, this is great. I can actually make a call in my home for the first time on the phone.
Yeah. So my point being, and I've got the same issue. I've got one bar at my house inside, and so before Wi-Fi calling, I was hosed. I'd have to try to find the right place to stand and all this other stuff to make sure I had a reliable call. Now everything works great because it's going over Wi-Fi. So the MNOs are happy to deliver one of their most important services, probably declining in importance, I guess. But anyway, what they said historically was one of their most important services over an untrusted Wi-Fi network. And it's how, the majority of my calls are made.
Yeah.
So I think
it's not so fucking untrusted,
put
is
paid
it?
to all of that, really.
It's untrusted until it's advantageous to you to use it.
Exactly.
To your point about the business model, Ian, I know nothing about Republic, but I would guess that what we're looking at is the more classic internet business model, which is to build up an audience and then worry about monetizing it later. So maybe their business model was just get a bunch of people on this and then we'll try and flog advertising or premium services or whatever.
EE Wi-Fi calling is just basically taking somebody off the cellular network.
I was talking about a different thing. I was just answering your mulling about what their business model might have been. That's all.
I mean,
well, and it made it into Google had an offering for a while called Google Fi. And I know that Republic worked with them pretty closely, so I think some of their IP went in there.
Well, there we are. And Google is the ultimate exponent of the business model I was just talking about, where it's just give shit away for free and then worry about monetizing that massive audience later.
Just going back to some of the stuff I was asking, this business about the Wi-Fi guys and what their perspective is on all this, and
well, I'm sad to hear that you haven't really heard what
that's just my own.
The collective voice isn't
right.
the loudest.
But this is
that means I've failed because that's been my job for that's been my job for quite a while, really. So
well, we've got you now.
Yeah, well, here we are.
Better late than never, Dave.
Yeah. So I think about. Ericsson, right? 90% of our time, this is Ericsson July 23 report, right? So 90% of our time is spent indoors and 80% of our data is consumed indoors. And this was in a thing about how 5G indoors was going to solve the world's problems. But, I'm just going to take those data points and say, yes, I fully agree. And that 80% of data is largely going over Wi-Fi, right, in our homes or in our offices, et cetera, et cetera. And the more that, we're consuming our entertainment online and doing all this other stuff, that's typically in our homes, when we're streaming. I don't tend to stream when I'm, out and about. So Wi-Fi is carrying all of this traffic, right? And there haven't been – so, we were kind of talking about which bands. And again, love you, Phil. 3.5 is not a Wi-Fi band. So 2.4, 5 gigahertz, and 6 gigahertz are essentially the
So the lower 6 gigahertz is Wi-Fi.
Well, it depends on which country you're talking about.
Yeah, right. Okay.
To me, it's 6 gigahertz. That would be 5925 to 7125. Okay. Here in the UK, it is 5945 because there's a 20 megahertz guard band from 25 to 45.
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier. Man.
Right. So 5945 to 6425 is where it's
right, and then that's when they start talking about upper 6425 up to 7125.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. So what I was going to say is if you think about it was literally 85-ish when the FCC started talking about taking the 2.4 ISM band and making it a unlicensed band, license exempt, depending on your terminology. And then it was 98, 99 before the first Wi-Fi router / access point was introduced into the market. And then a few years later, the MacBook and off we go to the races. And now, Wi-Fi is pretty much in everything. So the 2.4 band was only 83 megahertz of spectrum. It's very well utilized at this point in time to the point where most people sort of ignore 2.4 altogether just because you can't get – and it's also kind of coming back to the cellular discussion about you need the wide – they call them carriers. We would call them channels, to really get a – quote-unquote 5G experience or to get, a Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 7 experience, you kind of want a wide channel. You can really only do 20 megahertz wide channels in 2.4 Wi-Fi band. You go to 5 gigahertz, you could do 40 megahertz channelizations because there was more spectrum available in 5 gigahertz. 5 gigahertz started being rolled out in around 2000. The original ISM identification had a little bit of 5, but then they added to it in the early 2000s. But it had been like 20 years that the Wi-Fi industry had been making do with 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. And you think about the introduction of the iPhone in 2007, 8.
So they've been stuck with these two bands for 20 years.
Yeah, exactly.
While the cellular operators have been sort of been given
constantly
everything.
bitching about.
Yeah, that's the way it felt like for sure. And we're like,
this is brilliant.
Hey, we could use a little more.
And meanwhile, traffic growth, I'm guessing, on Wi-Fi has gone up a fair amount.
It really has.
But part of it is, and this isn't, I didn't know until I said it that it directly reflects on you as an advocate. But part of it is, from my point of view, that the cellular industry seems to have a louder collective voice. And one of the reasons will be because the stakeholders, there's fewer of them and they're larger in numbers. It's easier for them to collaborate. Whereas the Wi-Fi industry is incredibly
disparate.
Yeah.
No, it is, but I would have thought people like HPE and Cisco and Ruckus and these big kind of enterprise providers would go, well, we're selling these access points, and unless the spectrum's there and available for people to actually make use of it, then what are we going to do?
I work for all three of those companies you just named, so that's interesting. I would have thought they'd have made a louder noise about it in a way. I think we are. It's just maybe not in the circles.
You're inadvertently cussing him again.
Yeah.
He was making a loud noise. You just didn't fucking hear it.
No, wind the clock back. So I would say 2012. I'm pretty sure it was 2012. Up until then, the unlicensed in the Wi-Fi industry largely was sort of on autopilot. We'd gotten the 2.4 band, we'd gotten the 5 band. We were just off doing our thing. Life was good, blah, blah, blah. And then, I'm pretty sure it was 2012. Qualcomm came up with a proposal to do what was called LTE-U, right?
LTE unlicensed.
LTE and unlicensed spectrum.
Right.
And, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of history with that one too. But the original version that they were proposing for the U.S. kind of specifically, because we have some different regulatory requirements for unlicensed or lesser requirements actually than Europe. They were going to do this sort of duty cycle based approach where on the cellular side, they would sort of decide how much of the band or how much of the spectrum could be used by LTE, and then whatever they didn't need, Wi-Fi could use. And we all lost our collective minds going, that's not right and not how it should work.
And presumably the cellular gets the first shout, and then you only get to use it if
that was sort of what their deal was. We said, no, that's not going to work for us. And I ended up in a congressional hearing room getting yelled at by the guy who is now one of my bosses at a consulting firm, telling us to sort it all out. And anyhow,
I love those congressional hearings, especially the ones that are broadcast. They're so theatrical. They're so performative.
They can be. They certainly can be. But the point being, that was a big wake-up call to the Wi-Fi industry to say, hey, you guys are not playing in this regulatory and this advocacy arena at all. The only company, and to their credit, that really was doing it was Cisco. I have to say that they had been playing the game even before then. But the rest of the industry was like, oh crap, if we don't wake up and start paying attention to what's going on, this stuff could go sideways on us in a big hurry. And again, it's the lifeblood for billion-dollar businesses for a lot of these companies. So, in the last 13 years, the good news is the Wi-Fi industry has really ramped up. We still have, to my mind, more to do. But now, like you said, Rail Ruckus, HPE, Cisco, Extreme, Juniper Mist, along with a bunch of other, companies that use Wi-Fi or even some of the hyperscalers who rely on unlicensed spectrum, they've all gotten involved in, this advocacy for license exempt and unlicensed, and private cellular too. That's a whole other conversation. So I feel like we've made a lot of progress in, call it 13 years, but we have a lot more to do. The challenge, as you said, Scott, is it's sort of that classic thing. I've got an incumbent industry with a handful of global companies, right? That they're all completely aligned in their business model,
and they increasingly manage to position themselves as strategically vital as well.
Oh yeah,
that's always been the rhetoric around 5G and Huawei and China and all that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. No, and the politicians have bought into it,
Totally.
And we can talk about why that is, and I might do.
We might do. Careful what you wish for, mate.
Have they bought in though partly because of this? It's an awkward one for the cellular operators, obviously, because they don't want to go and spend £20 billion on spectrum again, as they did in the UK in sort of 1999, 2000 or whenever for 3G. There's this argument on the one hand that they should actually not be spending and maybe just held to some coverage requirements. But,
right. Yeah.
But in a way, I suppose, if they can say, well, we're going to cough up quite a bit for this spectrum, and if it's unlicensed, there's not these big kind of auction processes that generate these revenues for the government. And Gordon Brown went off on a big spending spree, didn't he, after the last sort of big the 3G auction, I think. We're clearing loads of debts.
Yeah, we're dealing with it right now in the U.S., where Congress is trying to get their budget together, and
it was $100 billion on C-band, or more than that, wasn't it?
C-band, it was 80.
Right.
Yeah, it was 80. But there's this effort right now. They passed these sort of goals for both the House and the Senate. And the House Energy and Commerce, which is sort of the lead committee for this, I think they were asked to cut like $880 billion, right? Find $880 billion in savings in the budget. And so, they're looking all over the place. And what they're really trying not to do is to have to cut Medicaid, which is one of our big health programs in the States.
Right.
And so, obviously cutting that would not be popular with most of their constituents.
So
they're saying if we can raise,
if we can get another $100 billion from spectrum from operators,
exactly,
rather than leaving it unlicensed,
that
sorts out a few problems.
Right. So, Yeah, that's what's happening right now. Unfortunately, it's very short-term thinking. It doesn't take into account any of the clearing or relocation costs associated with making that spectrum available to auction in the first place, right? So all the bands that are sort of under consideration are used, right? There's no greenfield spectrum below 10 gigahertz really anywhere. Certainly not in developed countries like the UK or the US or pretty much anywhere. So yeah, you've got to look at, okay, what's it going to cost me to move the incumbents, whether they're federal incumbents or commercial incumbents, somewhere else? Can I move them? How long is that going to take? Blah, 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 and that's not being factored into this process.
But they did get a hit with the upper 6 gigahertz band, didn't they? Because most of the Americas, as I understand it, has sort of said this is going to be unlicensed.
Right.
That decision was taken a few years ago.
2020.
And it's not going to be reversed, it seems.
No, it's not, I don't believe.
And why
Some people would like it to be, but I don't think
Why did that happen when the rest of the world is now sort of fixated on this, it seems, or certainly Europe is, with this letter being sent? And yet, I thought that letter, by the way, just to I thought it was incredibly misleading, a lot of
That's the story of yours that I mentioned.
This suggestion that it would create this fragmentation in the industry when one massive region of the world has already decided it's not going to be used for 6G anyway, I thought was typical GSMA deception as far as I'm concerned. I'm not expecting you to comment on that. That's just me saying that. But I just thought it was incredibly misleading, the whole way that they framed it on that point alone. But I'm just interested why that they did take this decision a few years ago to sort of put that aside for Wi-Fi.
Yeah. No, I thought, and I'm not going to disagree with you at all on your characterization of the letter, because I thought it was misleading and self-serving, myself. In terms of, why the U.S. made the decision for 1200 megahertz, and it's interesting now to think that, that was under the first Trump administration, for one thing, when Ajit Pai was the chairman of the FCC, and he's now president or CEO,
CTIA,
I can't remember the title of CTIA, and so he's now one of the people leading the charge for, we need more licensed spectrum, but he was the architect of, what we did with 6 gigahertz unlicensed, so that's
so it turns out some of these political types don't always mean everything they say.
Oh, yes.
It turns out they could be quite pragmatic at times.
Yes. But I think, in retrospect, I think that I think COVID may have had something to do with it, the pandemic, right? Because, that hit in, call it March of 20, and within a matter of, weeks, we were all living
on Wi-Fi.
home, and life was, sort of Wi-Fi connected there. And
definitely move Wi-Fi up the old pyramid of needs, or whatever, Maslow's pyramid hierarchy of needs.
Yeah. So I not to say that, the pandemic had really anything good associated with it, but I do think that, I think that was part of it. And I think, honestly, the commission felt, in the U.S., one of the things that people forget, in the U.S., what happened with both 6 gigahertz and C-band was that it was this, I'm going to go ahead and say it, it was an unholy alliance between some of the Wi-Fi interests, not everybody, but some of the Wi-Fi interests and some of the mobile interests. They got together and they went into the FCC and they said, let's look at 3.7, so C-band. I believe that's the downlink for the legacy satellite service. So let's look at the downlink as a mobile IMT band, and then let's look at the uplink, which is 6 gigahertz, is the next unlicensed band, because we were feeling the pain of 5 gigahertz being congested.
Quid pro quo type.
Well, it made sense, right? Yeah. Here's a way to address the mobile operators needs for 5G, and to make something available for unlicensed, because we haven't had anything new in 20 years, and this is adjacent to the 5 gigahertz band, so it's relatively easy for us to extend the equipment ecosystem up into 6 gigahertz from 5 gigahertz. Blah blah blah. So that was how it was packaged. Which is nowhere near
where mobile plays, by the way, at the moment, is it? As well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. 3 gigahertz. Well, you wrote the piece. Okay, I'm not going to jump tangents again, but we'll come back to that.
Happens to the best of us.
Yeah, but so that's how it was positioned, and there was a what's called a notice of inquiry that the FCC issued, and it was the mid-band notice of inquiry, and it was about 3.7 and 6 gigahertz, and it was a package. And so that's how this originally happened. And that was all fine and good, and they were happy with 3.7, and we were happy with 6. And then it was the 2017 timeframe, if I remember correctly, and I was at a conference in Kuala Lumpur, and a representative from MIIT China got up and started talking about, we'd like to do IMT or 5G in 6 gigahertz, and that was the first time. That was the first time I'd heard anybody talk about IMT in 6 gigahertz, and then it became a thing over the next few years. But it really originated from China, and now I would say GSMA is carrying the water on it.
I'm going to move it along soon, just because we want to cover one or two more topics before we run out of time.
One thing I was going to say is I just find it interesting that you were talking about this earlier when they went up from 2.4 to 5 and it freed up these bigger spectrum channels. But you're almost moved that as it goes up and up and up with cellular looking for higher bands because they've used all the lower stuff. You're moving into territory that really doesn't suit their mode of working, but very much suits the Wi-Fi mode of working.
Well, exactly.
I.e., it doesn't really travel very far, but it provides you with big channels. I.e., where would you use it? In a small area sitting down.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of building a network, and this is, I don't want to go into the details of the story I wrote on the massive MIMO stuff because all of Lum's technical points I'll forget now anyway, but basically it's just very expensive equipment that probably nobody's going to really build out on a.
We covered that a bit last time anyway.
If
you put this, MU MIMO 128 transmit receive chains up there, it's gonna. You better be reinforcing the poles and all this other stuff, right?
Yeah.
So, no, I mean exactly. I mean, you in your piece were talking about 3.5 not being the promised land for 5G, despite all the promises, and I fully agree with that, by the way. And I mean that's one of the things that I think why people are upset that T-Mo has the 2.5, 2.6 frequencies in the U.S. because it's better than 3.5. But now they're talking about if we don't get 6 gigahertz, then 6G is going to fail and you're going to lose the race to 6G and blah blah blah. And then it's like, okay, well, what are you going to do with 6 gigahertz as in a macrocellular context?
Totally.
And it's like, okay, well, we'll do this massive MU MIMO stuff on the base station side. Like, okay, well, you got all the ERLUM issues there, first of all.
Yeah.
And then it's like, what about the UE? What the UE is
I didn't even go into that in what I wrote.
What about the uplink?
Yeah.
So you're going to use this as a downlink only? So now, I don't know. The whole thing it doesn't make any sense. And like you said, 6 gigahertz is perfect for lower power, indoor wide channel uses, which is what Wi-Fi is.
So I'd like to massively simplify it all. If we say midband for the sake of argument starts at 3 gigahertz.
Don't exclude the 2.5. Say 2.
All right. I'll say 2.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. If you want. How about meeting in the middle, 2.5?
That's fine. I'm good with 2.5.
We'll start at 2.5.
This is a CTI thing for me, so.
Yeah, fair enough. No, you got to fight your corner, totally. But let's say for the sake of argument, midband starts at 2.5 and goes up to whatever, 6, 10. It doesn't really matter. In principle, if you were starting from scratch, you'd just say, all right, cellular, you get everything below 2.5. Wi-Fi get everything above 2.5 or something like that. That would seem to make sense from to massively reduce and simplify what we were just talking about.
Well, then you get into this argument about are they capacity squeezed and the problems I have with that, and I think we don't want to go on about this too much because we talked about it last week, but this gets to this whole William Webb thing about slowing traffic, which most of the telcos are now saying. I mean, we were at an event last week where they're actually saying it's slowing down. Not only that, but there's a huge amount of spectrum there which is associated with old technologies that are going to be phased out.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm certainly not an expert on this, but I'm inclined to be sceptical for them to say that their capacity squeezed. For a lot of the things we've just been talking about for the last hour, how much of, for example, streaming video consumption is done over Wi-Fi anyway, and all that sort of thing. I mean, I don't know. I was dicking about on my phone on the train on the way down, and sometimes I had a 5G signal, and it wasn't really working very well. Whether that's because of some kind of spectrum capacity squeeze or not remains to be seen. It could have just been the unique dynamics of being on a train. Well, I don't know.
I think it's because there's no masts along the sides of the train track.
I know, but I had a little logo on my phone going, "I got 5G." Obviously, that could have been bollocks.
Yeah,
but don't get me started on that. Yeah, I guess
3.5 gig.
This one doesn't even support 5G NR, and I get 5G service indicators on it.
Yeah.
So
that could be one way of looking at it. There's just a couple other things I want to ask. I will give you I will invite you to bring up any other things to do with your core area that we haven't covered that you want to. But I just wanted to ask Ian about his feedback on some of the feedback he got on his story, Telco's guilty of 6G mixed messages and falsehoods. William Webb, very regular guest on this pod, shared it on LinkedIn and said very nice things about it. And a few, but I gather that you got some, and you certainly don't have to name them if it was done.
Well, I'll name a
off the
couple. I
record.
can name one at least.
But you got some people who weren't so keen on your piece. Tell us. About that.
There were people who liked it a lot, and there were people who, and that
It's a bit marmitey. It's polarised opinion.
But it's interesting. Some of the people who liked it a lot, and I won't mention them because it's like people just contact you on privately. But there were not necessarily who you might think would like it a lot.
Okay.
Like people who might be within telcos, for instance. But this guy posted on LinkedIn and didn't say particularly nice things about me, so I might as well mention it.
Yeah, go on.
Because it's on LinkedIn, so it's in the public.
It's public,
domain.
yeah. It's
He's
fair
called
game.
Kumar Balachandran, and he wrote quite a sort of...
Who's he work for?
I know Kumar.
He works for... he's a senior expert at Ericsson Research,
yeah.
and he wrote a response that I thought didn't really address any of the points that I made anyway. It was a bit sort of meandering, but then he sort of finished it off. By the way, Williams responded to him.
Okay.
But he finished it off by saying, "I've seen light reading spout utter nonsense from this author for a long time," which I thought... And then Williams sort of
Those
addressed
ad hominems are so fucking tedious.
I thought it was funny, but William Webb, who's responded because he's fairly sort of swift on getting back to people and all this stuff because it's like his ballpark. His number 6 point was light reading, not a very logical line of attack.
That sounds like William.
And William. I mean, he doesn't have a strong agenda.
It's interesting you know him, though. I don't know.
I do. Anyways.
William doesn't have a strong agenda, but he's obviously been talking. But he does have some of his sort of professional.
I've drunk loads.
Yeah, you're not fucking around, are you, Ian? He does have some of his sort of professional credibility attached to his predictions about the slowdown in traffic growth. So
I
that's fair
respect
enough.
that. He's not afraid to put it out there.
Yeah.
And
I just think...
Contrast that with all these people saying, "Hey,
cheerleaders."
Exactly.
Yeah.
And nobody's calling them to task. Where is the remote surgery and the
Yeah, totally. And I think it's got a lot of integrity because it doesn't play to most consultants would be thinking, well, how do I sort of? I mean, if you're going to be cynical about them, you'd say, well, they're going to be sort of telling people things they like to hear. Whereas saying you're basically industries like commoditized now and you're going to be looking at it this way is not.
Not making friends with that industry.
Well, and that's where this lad that you just cited who gave you that robust feedback on LinkedIn. Where I think he's misguided. I mean, you know him. You seem to like him. I'm sure he's a great bloke.
He's a nice,
but where I think he's
guy. I don't agree with him often.
Where I think that line of argument is misguided is as soon as you start getting into ad hominems and other rhetorical fallacies, I think you undermine your own position because the robust feedback would be to line by line or major point by major point.
Right.
Critique.
I think that's what William was probably saying, wasn't he?
Yeah. And don't just go, well, this bloke's a wanker.
I'd have actually preferred it if he'd said that. That would have made me laugh.
If he just had this stream of expletives.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean,
like something out of Asterix.
I mean, when I try to critique like the GSMA or the CTIA stuff, I try to take it apart point by point. Like, okay, they said this. Oh, well, actually, that's a indoor only band in China, and and 6 gigahertz hasn't been allocated or assigned. So that's misleading. But I don't just say they're a bunch of idiots.
Yeah, they're just full of shit. Yeah. Because anyone can say that. That's just like internet trolling. It's not difficult to just go, you're talking shit.
Yeah.
So that would be my critique. In the unlikely event that bloke's listening, given that he's such a big fan of yours, he probably doesn't. Or maybe he hate listens.
Well, he did read it. So I hate light reading that much. If he's read all these articles to form a view of what nonsense I generally.
And then the other way in which I'll defend Ian, of course I'm going to defend Ian. I'm biased, but is kind of picking up on the point you just made, Dave, which is you need. I think I don't like the use of the word contrarian because it sounds like it's a sort of compulsive, reflexive thing.
Right.
But you need people who aren't afraid to call bullshit. And if journalists aren't those people, then who the fuck is? So I think he's kind of missing the point.
One of the other ones actually fairly recently was Gabe, our colleague.
All right.
A heavy reader.
He doesn't mind pushing back.
Gabe Brown?
Yeah. So he, he's done one of those things where you reply to a tweet, but you can't see the original tweet. But I'm assuming it refers to this. And people like Paul Rhodes have been involved in this discussion. But so all I can see that he's written is agree. Conflating the two issues looks like Ian Morris is looking for an angle to make an argument. Both can be debated or be true false. I mean, I'll push back on that because I think you put it very succinctly when you said if they're going around saying, this is what I'm guessing he's saying, I shouldn't be saying it's a contradiction that both can be true. This idea that you can have a software-based network and be saying you don't want a big hardware refresh, but then begging for the entirety of an upper 6 gigahertz band that would require you to spend a lot of money if you're going to actually make decent use of it. I think it's a massive contradiction, I'm afraid. So
yeah,
unless he can sort of show me why he doesn't agree with that, then...
If I was going off the top of my head, steelman the position of your opponent, and by steelman, for people who don't know the term, it's like the opposite of strawman, try and view the argument in the best possible light, is that while it would require more kit along the massive MIMO stuff that we've been talking about, it's not a waveband technology shift. It's not a total overhaul. It perhaps could be viewed as just an incremental increase in the amount of kit rather than just a generational refresh. The use of all this
6G.
So I'm trying to give the opponents of your piece the benefit of the doubt. And they might say, well, it's not a total generational overhaul, not a massive refresh required by a fundamentally new technology. It's just an incremental increase in the size and
that's
weight
what they were
and expense.
saying with the NGMN thing. Well, that's not the same as saying we need the whole of the upper 6 gigahertz band.
But isn't your argument? So you're saying that that's contradictory because if you need the whole of the
upper 6 gigahertz, this is the whole point of the piece I wrote. Is that you need very expensive equipment to roll that out.
Next generation RAN.
Right, and just so it would be an overhaul. So my attempt to steelman their position is misguided because it would be a complete overhaul.
And use it and put the radios that you're building for 5G in it.
Fair enough. A software upgrade.
You'd have to put very expensive 6G equipment, even though it might not be a completely radically new air interface. You're still building these massive MIMO units with 256 transmitters and receivers in. And that would be hugely expensive.
And meanwhile, we know that the business model of most of the mobile operators, is a little challenged both in Europe and the U.S., right? So, I mean, for the longest time, we've been saying that they should densify their networks, right? If they want to add capacity without, always needing more spectrum, one of the ways to do it is to densify the network. And then they come back and say, well, we can't densify the network.
By densify, you just mean more cells?
Yeah, more cells, lower power, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's how you add capacity with the same amount of spectrum.
Yeah.
I can read you out what seems like a very considered pushback on what I wrote by someone who's probably, given whose name it is, and I'm not going to read that out, might be someone who's in a telco and quite senior. This is the email. I'm not sure what mixed messages you're hearing. Obviously, new spectrum will require new hardware. The carriers are aware of that. When they talk about 6G being a software upgrade from 5G, they're referring to the existing spectrum bands not needing new antennas or radios to upgrade.
Yeah, that's kind of the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, well, hang on a minute. Any additional spectrum that's auctioned will require new radios and antennas, but only for those new bands. Upgrading the current spectrum from 5G to 6G will not require new hardware and will be a software upgrade.
Okay.
Adding new spectrum and new hardware only in congested areas that need it won't be expensive at all. I mean, I completely push back on all of that. I think that's nonsense. This gets to the whole point. You're not going to refarm existing spectrum that's got 4G and 5G in it now.
Yeah, you've made that point earlier, and I agree with you.
Right. I mean,
and if you refarm 3G bands, then you've got narrow channels, so you're not going to get a 6G experience.
Exactly. So I mean, is he talking about? I think what he's getting to is the sort of stuff that Ericsson goes on about with all of its bullshit about programmable networks and that you can introduce these new software features on the same hardware. But to me, that's not a generational change. That's just providing some new bits and pieces here and there to do with things like network slicing and quality on demand and stuff that's never ever going to go anywhere. That's not a new generation thing. So you're not going to refarm that. Those 4G and 5G systems will be around for ages. I mean, 2G and 3G is only going to be phased out by the 2030s. The Ericsson's saying.
And you're not getting white panels out of that anyway.
Who's probably involved in doing this research. You're saying that 2G and 3G is still going to be there in 2030. So if there's no way that anybody's going to change those spectrum bands they're using for 4G and 5G now, they're certainly not going to refarm it if the new air interface isn't that much better.
Because what's the point?
Because what's the point?
Well, then you see 6G and you're getting 10,
and then the point
megabits.
about that they're just going to use the upper 6 gigahertz bands for a few filling
Where they
areas.
need it.
Well, why do they need so much of it then?
Right.
Why do they need the whole thing? Why are they making such a big fuss about capacity? And we're all in crisis unless we get it. If it's a few infill areas here and there.
And again, I would say, what about the UE side of things? Okay, you're going to use MU-MIMO on the base station side, and you're going to figure out ways to address you're going to deploy it on the same grid as 3.5, blah blah blah, because we're going to have new technology. Okay, but what about the client? I mean, the client doesn't have the power for this.
Right.
You're going to use it a downlink only service, supplemental downlink. I mean,
that's a good point. Yeah.
So
in building, it's not going to penetrate.
The more I try and look at this objectively, the more suspicious I am of this whole thing being these people who just, like, I think William called it the old playbook. You just keep doing the same thing, which is to assume that you need more and more and more and more spectrum, whether it's keeping out the hands of guys who might be competitors or whether it's just that it's the guys who are responsible.
Or it's just because they've got no other ideas.
Oh, they've got no other ideas.
It's wash, rinse, repeat. I mean, it is.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, now we're losing the race to 6G. I thought we were still losing the race to 5G. I mean, which is it?
So I'm going to move it on, but Dave, as I promised, before I move it on from your core area of sort of spectrum policy and all that sort of thing, are there any things that that we've discussed or that you wanted to talk about prior to this that we haven't touched on that you'd like to flag up?
Well, one thing that I think came up earlier that I didn't really address well enough was just this idea that, politicians like license spectrum because it goes at auction and they can use that to pay down treasury debt or, whatever, offset spending, pay for other programs, blah, blah, blah.
Just throw it into that black hole of like the fiscal deficit.
Well, there we go. Yes, we're good at that in the West these days. But
what's the US one? About 10 trillion or something?
Oh, no. I think we're at 37-ish,
Nice.
But, and I mean, I can remember when it seemed like an annual $400 billion deficit was a lot, and now, we don't blink our eye at a trillion.
Don't even bat an eyelid.
Yeah, at all.
Yeah. But Elon Musk just saved like 200 billion, so that's
There we go.
how many percent is that?
There we go. Put it against.
Well, no, that was the whole
According to him,
Doge.
The whole Doge effort. Yeah.
And now he got bored and fucked up.
He's on this little Saudi Arabian entourage, I noticed.
Oh, is he?
Together with all the other misfits.
But my point would be, and again, the Wi-Fi industry's in this last 13 years done a lot. Now we're commissioning, economists to go out and study what is the value of Wi-Fi to a national economy, right? And in the U.S., I'm going to mangle this, but it's something like 1.2 trillion annually in GDP contribution from Wi-Fi, right? And it's just like all the things that you can do with Wi-Fi that would go away if it
was pretty ubiquitous,
wasn't around, and everything else. And so I mean that's
I
where
want to
I'm
see papers on that Wi-Fi's contribution to GDP. Actually, like if you've got any
he's probably written
documentation on that, you can
certainly
happily whiz it over to me. I'm all over this.
Oh, I can already see a future Ian Morris piece in the
works.
works.
We'll be getting that soon. So, So I want to
antagonize people like that Ericsson geezer even more.
Yeah. I just want to make sure I talked about that because, I mean, there's got to be more to how do we, quote unquote, value spectrum than just on what I can get for it when I auction it, right?
Yeah.
And the innovation potential of it, right? I mean, we didn't really talk about, the West versus the East and sort of approaches to spectrum management. But, I think the American, I think even the Western approach to spectrum management largely has been, if I make at least some spectrum available sort of openly to anyone, innovation happens and uncontrolled innovation happens. And it's like the internet, just start up.
No, that's a really good point.
Do stuff. Whereas if it's all controlled by a small group of people, where's the innovation? I mean, honestly,
the mode thing, isn't it?
Well, I'm going to slam them. I mean, so where's the innovation in the mobile industry? And this is one of Dean Bubley's points, quite often is, what they complain about the over the tops, or they complain now about the content providers putting all this load on their networks and blah, 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 and they should be paying us. But it's like, they delivered a consumer mobile service however many years ago that was, and what have they done since then?
Yeah.
Yes, and that's
pretty much it.
At the Omdia event that we did after we recorded the last podcast that we just alluded to at the start in the opening bollocks section. Once they'd done all their presentations, I stood up and did a complete off the cuff. I had no notes. I didn't even make any notes while they're doing it. I was just winging it. But it occurred to me, and I know it's stating the bleeding obvious, but sometimes it can be clarifying to restate it, that the telecoms industry is a high value, low growth industry, much like a utility, which is obviously the word that really antagonizes them.
They do not like that word.
They don't like that at all.
Some of them aren't very high value anymore.
Yeah.
No, some of them aren't even very high value.
It's not very high value, I don't think.
And one of the reasons it's low growth is because of how difficult it is to innovate. Now, I have some sympathy because, as I said on the thing, from the consumer side, what imperative is there for me to give them more money than I currently do? If anything, our individual ARPU is incrementally inching downwards because we're finding savings. Like I do a thing where I have a more expensive subscription, but then the rest of my family are on the entry-level subscription, and I gift them data. And that was thanks to an innovation that the industry created. But unfortunately, with that innovation, they've enabled me to lower the collective ARPU of the four of us.
Yeah.
So I do have some sympathy because it's hard. How do you get us to pay more for what is quite a linear, quite a commoditized, simple service, which is connectivity? But, where to the point you were making, and you were referencing people like Dean's, also a regular guest on this pod, they don't, with all their moaning about, widening the moat by dedicating more spectrum to them instead of unlicensed bands, you're not sympathetic when they do such a shit job of innovating.
Exactly. Right. Well, that was one of the things in that letter, too, was like, it's going to stifle European innovation. And I'm just like, that could not be further from the truth, right? If you want to encourage innovation, make it open and let anybody play here.
And that's where actually, even though you got criticism from a guy from Ericsson, I at least give them the benefit of the doubt for trying this network exposure thing. That's an attempt at innovation. I think there's plenty of reasons to be skeptical that it will succeed. But I at least think, okay, at least they're giving it a go.
But that's crap. That's not innovation. Like, innovation is people are running Wi-Fi networks for 8 hours a day or something while they're working, and you're on your 5G network for probably while you're outdoors and getting a sandwich.
I think about in my home, right? Ring doorbells, and like I've got a Wi-Fi connected irrigation controller that talks to the Met service so it doesn't water my lawn if it's going to rain.
Yes.
And
like things that can come out of
stuff that actually is helpful.
Network exposure is just the industry's.
I get notified when my dryer load is done now over Wi-Fi. I mean, it's little stuff, but it's like, that's kind of cool. And I look at what's happening in the private wireless space, and it's the same thing. It's like, the GSMA, again, talking about pejoratives, right? They have this thing. I wrote this paper totally taking apart their don't do spectrum set-asides. That was their message to regulators. Don't set aside spectrum, 3.7, 3.8 in Germany, or 3.8 to 4.2 here in the UK, right? That's terrible. It all needs to be full power, exclusive use. We will do what people need. We will deliver the private wireless services for people using network slicing and all this other stuff, right? Okay, great. Meanwhile, in the real world, you've got all sorts of small companies doing all sorts of really cool stuff with their own LTE and 5G networks that they've deployed and they're operating, so oil companies, gas companies, ports, airports, AGVs, people using it for seismic sensoring, people using it to monitor power lines. There's all sorts of innovation going on, and it's happening outside of the mobile industry.
Yeah, that's proper innovation, is what you get from actually using the stuff. Network exposure is just an attempt to try and sell connectivity in a different way.
Fair enough.
By the way, you got quite enthusiastic. One thing I did want to say, you got quite enthusiastic during the Omdia thing about this B2B2C idea. I think Bruno,
and that was in the context of that network exposure. I could see it as a viable commercial channel.
Yeah, so which was basically the idea that if you want a gaming slice for low latency or something like that, that it's maybe not the consumer
you buy it off the gaming platform.
It might be the gaming application developer. So I had to think about this because you mentioned it, and I was.
I like to think that you think about me. I
was having to think about it in the shower, and I thought basically
in the shower.
Oh dear!
I was thinking
steady.
What this basically sounds like is that's fair share, isn't it? You're trying to get money from the company that goes over the top to use your service.
I don't think so. I don't want to talk about it too long because I keep trying. Well, give me a sec. Because I keep trying to squeeze a couple of other things in before we finish, before we run out of time. The reason I don't think it's fair share is because it's not legislative. It's not top down, a policy imposition. If it works, and this is all hypothetical, if it works, it's because the gaming platform in this particular example sees an advantage to buying a premium service from the operator in order to bundle that together with whatever other premium shit they're selling to their
so there's two scenarios. One, they're forced to do it, which is fair share. One is they have two options. So are they going to go for this or are they not going to go for this?
Indeed.
And they're going to have all the same questions that a consumer has about what am I really getting from doing this? You know, if you're in a dungeon and you're gaming, can you really provide a guarantee? This is because one thing that the gaming company is going to worry about that the consumer doesn't is when this fails and your consumer goes, hang on a minute, I thought
who are they going to blame?
Who are they going to blame? I'm afraid that's a really good point.
Case. That's really good. Is. Okay, well, thanks,
that B2B2C thing.
Thanks, mate. And all your articles are shit.
No, I mean it's not you. I'm not having to go at you.
I mean,
unless you're backing it, unless you want to put some money on it. But
no. Well, I mean, a lot of times, what I do is try and steal man. I just try. You know, I think. In the name of balance, where I'll sit here and go, you're never innovating, you're never coming up with any ideas, I try and balance that position by giving them credit for something. But you're completely right to push back, and that's why it sets up a good conversational dynamic, because I'm putting their what I perceive as their best foot forward, and then you're pushing back, which I think is good. But look, honestly, if you don't mind, because we've only got half an hour or so left. I wanted to talk, given that we're talking about policy, I've got a bit of a policy tangent, which is the only two stories I've written this week, which are to do with US policy. But
not doing Rakuten.
That's going to be a last thing.
Right. Because there's a natural segue onto Rakuten from this, but okay.
Okay.
The other way around.
Well, yeah, we can do that. We can do it that way.
It's all about spectrum.
Well, why don't we do that? Do you know what? I kind of need to go to the bog. Okay. So why don't seeing as you're pushing for the Rakuten thing, you can queue it up while I go off.
So Rakuten's a Japanese telco that's come along. I mean, Dave, you'll be aware of them in Japan, building a fourth mobile network in the last few years. I think it's fair to say it's not gone as they would have hoped. I think this project started probably back in. I'm trying to think. I think it was maybe 2019, 2020 that they hired this guy called Tarek Amin.
Yeah.
Who'd sort of got celebrity status in the industry because I think he was the guy who was behind Reliance Jio's rollout in India. And I think the mistake they made was to assume that what had happened in India could happen in Japan, and what happened in India was that a company that was relatively unknown, but actually did have a very big backer in like the world's one of the world's richest men. Certainly India's was backing this operator that built a greenfield network, and now it's the biggest company in India. And I think they Hiroshi Mikitani at Rakuten saw what was going on and thought, well, if I can lure Tarek Amin, who's been talking a lot about introducing new look technologies to do that network, which, by the way, I don't think have much to do with why Reliance Jio was super successful, really.
Market dynamics there, for sure.
Dynamics. I don't think it was to do with the fact that he was using automation and cloud technologies and this
Probably
sort of thing.
Not.
And certainly there was no Open RAN involved anyway. But he lured Tarek Amin, and they had this project in Japan where they were going to come along and disrupt the Japanese cellular industry and build this fourth mobile network and hopefully have more than the number of subscribers they have today. And it's basically been a bit of a disaster, I think it's fair to say. I mean, I think if you're going to be kind to them, you could say that they have actually managed to build a nationwide greenfield network that seems to work reasonably well for the number of customers it's supporting, unlike Boost Mobile in the US, which has been much more problematic. Bigger country, I know, and different challenges, but they have got a network up and running. The main problem, they've not really got any customers. I mean, they've got, in a country of 125 million people, and I think like 200 subscriptions because of that issue of people using more than one device. They've got fewer than 8 million on the network, And it looked. I remember like writing about Rakuten sort of a year and a half ago. It looked like they were starting on a bit of a growth curve, and they'd signed up quite a few in a couple of quarters. And you look at the figures today, and they're pretty disappointing. It looks like they've lost some as competitors responded with pricing offers, and they've got this horrible situation at the moment where. Yeah. Sorry, Dave. Go on.
No. I was just going to say. I mean, what do you compete on here, right? I mean, that's the thing. What is there to compete on other than price? Right, if there's nothing really new or
they've made this deal, this big thing about they've got because they're using more software-based network technologies that they've got this mass, and they're very heavily automated. So I remember talking to them in the past about how many people they have, like on the operations side, and they'll always say, "Well, we've got a small number of people. It's a few hundred, whereas NTT Docomo would have a few thousand." But unfortunately, it doesn't really translate into the numbers they publish. It's not like it's giving them a big enough advantage to make that much of a difference. Their operating costs are still higher than what they're making in. Like revenues.
They're losing money.
They're losing money, and
unless that can translate into a subscription price that is so remarkably lower than all those other three operators that they can attract 20% of the market to convert overnight. How does that impact anything?
Part of their bright idea was some of these fabled synergies, because they're a big digital company as well.
Well, I'm dubious about the fabled synergies, because one thing I noticed today is there's two ways. There are only two ways now for them to actually make a profit, because I think they've pulled operating costs down as much as they possibly can. It's basically flattened for the last 8 quarters. I've been tracking that sort of number. So the only way they can really go into profit is to grow the number of subscribers, and it will carry on going up. They probably will break even at some point. They claimed this quarter actually to have broken even on the EBITDA level for the first time, but there was lots of caveats.
Yeah, that was our headline.
Yeah, operating profit they didn't break even. But they will get there just on subscriber growth eventually. But if you look at the ARPU stuff, which is the other way of doing it, it's very flat. And I've noticed what they're doing with ARPU is they're bundling in money that mobile customers are spending on other Rakuten products,
synergies,
which to me is
it's a bit cheeky.
It's a bit cheeky, I think. I think I described it as dubious in my write-up, because it's not like you're. I mean, I get the point. I get the idea of synergies, that if you're a Rakuten mobile customer, you're more likely maybe to sign up to their other Rakuten products,
streaming
and
or e-commerce or whatever.
I totally go along with that, but I think to actually take money that those companies generate and say this is part of our ARPU is a bit.
Well, their whole business model kind of lends itself to accounting fudges, doesn't it?
That would be. I mean, I get like HBO Max with my mobile subscription in the States. That would be like AT&T reporting the Max revenue, right? It's part of theirs.
Well, there we are. I mean, it's an interesting thing. Coming at it from a different direction, AT&T in an M&A direction, and all that M&A I think has been catastrophic. But but their bright idea was these synergies between being the comms provider and the content provider and all that sort of thing.
Well, it kind of goes back to the innovation thing. They just felt like they've been left behind, so now they got to go buy some assets. Just
go and buy something different and roll the dice in that direction.
But the spectrum issue they have, which I think is their other problem. So all the time you notice when they've had quite a lot of quality of service problems. Nothing to do with, by the way, with Open RAN or some of these new technologies that are being used. I don't think it disproves that those things work. I think they've actually done a good job of showing that the stuff that they're rolling out works. The trouble they have is loads of people use phones in Japan on undergrounds, they use them in high-rise buildings, and Rakuten's just got really crap spectrum holdings. So I compared what it's got to what BT's got. So I looked at the Competition Authority stuff to get BT's numbers on the Vodafone 3 merger, and they've got 350 megahertz of spectrum, and 230 megahertz of that is between 1400 and 2.6 gigahertz.
That's right.
Pretty decent.
And if you look at, what's Rakuten got? Well, if you take all the millimeter wave stuff out of the equation, because that's useless, let's be honest, they've got 186. They've got 100 megahertz in 3.5 gigahertz, which is also a band that requires, let's be honest, quite a lot of densification.
Yeah.
And that leaves them with 86 megahertz of paired and unpaired spectrum in these sort of lower bands. It's not very much spectrum. And I think even if you compare them with the other Japanese telcos, they're kind of quite badly off. But the problem with that is they've had to build they keep having to build more and more base stations out to sort of address these coverage problems. And it's like every quarter, they've just sort of said today we need to add another 10,000 base stations up and down the country to sort out coverage issues.
OpEx.
So do you think when Rakuten Mobile was created, the Japanese government and regulators should have forced the three incumbents to free up a bit more spectrum for them?
I don't think they should have forced them to do anything. I think if Rakuten Mobile was going to do a business plan, it should have figured out that it could get access to spectrum.
Yeah.
But you do get like typically in Europe when they want to have a merger like what we've got with Vodafone and Three. Often in the past, I think they've done it in France and in Italy. They've gone, all right, you can merge, but then you've got to create enough stuff to create another fourth one. But then, as Ian rightly says, this Rakuten one wasn't a result of the merger. Just Rakuten just thought, fuck it, we'll get involved with mobile. Yeah, so that's different.
I mean, if there's not spectrum there, and some of it in all countries, some of it's held by the Ministry of Defence, some of it's used for other purposes.
Yeah. I was going to say that. Yeah, because you earlier said, what if we just took everything below 2.5 and gave it a cellular and everything above 2.5 to Wi-Fi? And I was going to make that point that Ian just said. Yeah, there are other people here who need spectrum, right? I mean, so satellite services and particularly the government, and not just the military, but, space research and med
Someone's got to control those drones.
FAA altimeters, I mean,
that 7 gigahertz to 15 gigahertz or whatever that they're talking about for 6G as well in the future. That's like one of that's part of that sort of golden, not really golden band. It's more like a golden range as they call it. But bits of that are used by like NATO in Europe, for instance. Are they going to relinquish that when like Russia's about to invade in the next 10 years or whatever?
Well, that's like this stuff going on in the U.S. where, there's a lot of pressure on the U.S. Defense Department to make spectrum available. At the same time, you got the Trump administration saying we wanted to play this Golden Dome, defense system based on the Israeli stuff. And it's like, hey, that's going to create more demands on spectrum, not, and meanwhile, you're telling us to free it up.
There's always, as I think Thomas Sowell said, one of his famous quotes is, "There's no solutions, only trade-offs," which I think is just
the economist, Thomas Sowell.
Yeah,
I love him.
Yeah, he's brilliant.
Yeah.
And that's such a succinct quote. There's no absolute solution. There's no panacea. There's no magic wand. Anytime you give to something, you have to take something from somewhere. Take it from somewhere else. And that doesn't mean that everything's a zero-sum game, because I think we can all agree, and this is part of, I think, what you were insisting on earlier about unlicensed spectrum, is there are certain environments where a rising tide will lift all ships. I.e., it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a slice of pie where if you give one person a slice of pie, then the other person doesn't get it. Sometimes everyone can benefit. I suppose to torture the metaphor, the pie can get bigger. But
starting to sound like a mixture of Confucius and George W. Bush Jr.
Well, I like to mix not just my metaphors, but my philosophies.
Nice.
But yes, the trade-offs. It is normally trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And that was a very wise thing he said. And Thomas Sowell has said a lot of wise things.
Agreed.
But yes, I mean, I just think that's interesting. In fact, with the I've got some thoughts about the final segment I was going to take it onto, but I don't want to interrupt the Rakuten.
No, I mean those are my main points about Rakuten. Really, I just think they've got to the stage where they've become a lot less interesting. I mean, I'll give you a segue actually.
Yeah.
The guy who used to.
Oh yes.
So here's my segue for Scott before I do what you've just done. He was the guy who was lured, who I started talking about when I introduced it. Tariq Amin, who I think was a really colourful character, by the way, and he's good for journalists.
Yeah.
Like journalists,
he was a LinkedIn sensation for quite a while.
I mean, he's like. I think he's just really good value for money if you're a reporter, because he'll kind of sit there and say, yeah, we're going to invest in all these GPUs and we're going to completely turn around Japan or something. And he'll come out with all these kind of grand statements, and I think he kind of
Trumpy in that way.
He kind of kept them in the spotlight, and he's obviously a very smart guy as well. He's quite charismatic, and I think losing him has not been good for them in terms of if they're trying to be in the spotlight, it's not been a good thing for them to have lost that kind of personality. Someone who was a kind of fluent English speaker, and he was.
And there's even fewer of them in telecoms. Let's be honest.
Exactly, yeah. And
they haven't had nothing, like you were saying, I don't think they've had a news story for quite a while, right? I mean,
they haven't.
They played that card for quite a while, but it sort of played itself out.
Yeah, and I think maybe he thought. I mean, there was a lot of speculation about why he left at the time that he did, and I think his version of events was family reasons, and that's probably a lot of truth in that. But I think he might also have thought, really, and the network's built. Yeah. And we're probably not going to sign up a lot of customers because the Japanese just don't move operator. So why not get out now?
And where did he end up, Ian?
Where did he end up? Well, he went to Saudi Arabia, and then for a little while he was working for Saudi Aramco. But this week he's ended up working for this company called Humane.
Yes,
which is exactly
which is big in the news. Yeah,
which is an AI company in Saudi Arabia.
And that is a bit of a segue to what I want to bang on about.
And he's basically there this week. He was in the BBC yesterday, meeting Donald Trump and bowing before. What's his name?
Mohammed bin Salman.
Yeah, I can never remember his name.
MBS, not IBS, which I got wrong on a previous podcast.
He's basically like in charge of Saudi Arabia's main AI asset, which is a pretty big job.
Yeah, and it's funny you said
gone on to bigger places.
Yeah, I can't remember whether he specifically said that, and maybe Pierre's about to say this. When he said, I'm leaving for family reasons, his family won't be unhappy with the amount of wedge he's getting off the Saudis right now.
I suspect not.
Were you about to make a comment to that effect? Yeah.
No.
I just saw you lift the mic to your face. So, okay. Okay, well, I'll move it on. And Ian's now going to shuffle past all of us.
All right.
I've got. So these are a couple of more. We've been talking about spectrum policy. And these are policy-related things, but it's a bit more current affairs-y, and it is American-related. And I'll stress to you, I always say to our guests, whether they're from the US or not, that you're free to plead the fifth if this stuff gets a bit sort of professionally complicated for you to comment on fully.
Okay.
But there's a couple of stories I've written this week, about the only stories I've written this week, actually. There was one I wrote on Monday, which is to do with the whole tariff thing. Which, I reserve the right to talk about. We often have a sort of friendly tension on the pod because Ian, as I'm sure you can gather from his writing and his talking, he's much more in the weeds on the telecom side of things, whereas I've got this shitty attention span. And I can get a bit in the weeds, but I just find lots of other things interesting, and I find more the big picture.
I can tell. We go all over the place.
Yeah, the big picture sort of. Yeah, exactly. That's one of the reasons the pod's so tangential. And I quite often write about the current affairs side of things, and all this tariff stuff, I think is relevant. While it's not specifically telecoms, obviously it is business, and we are basically business journalists. It just happens that our beat is telecoms. Right. But, there's overlap between what we do and what the FT or the Wall Street Journal or whatever does. Mm-hmm. And so at the start of the week, I wrote a headline that said, Trump blinks as he pauses the last of the Liberation Day tariffs. So I presume you remember Liberation Day. That's when he had his little bit of cardboard showing how ripped off America's getting by everyone else in the world. Mm-hmm. And he basically decided through what turned out to be some fairly unsophisticated maths that everyone needs to pay tariffs on their exports to the US or of this amount based on basically the trade deficit between the two countries. Yeah. And that was obviously bollocks at the time, and we called it out as bollocks at the time, and we were hardly alone. Pretty much even like quite pro-Trumpy people were a bit like, well, steady on. Like one podcaster I listened to, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he's American, he's called Ben Shapiro.
Oh yeah.
And he's conservative, and he campaigned for Trump and all that sort of thing. But even he was sitting there going, well, hold on a sec, mate. This is looking like bollocks, to paraphrase him. And then not long after, he put a 90-day pause on all of them to everyone except China. I think he's kept a baseline 10% that was a new thing for him on the whole rest of the world of a tariff. But all the other more bespoke ones, like it'd be like tariffing total backwaters, just because they had a trade deficit, which of course they do, because they produce things like, I don't know, coconuts that America wants to buy, and they can't afford to buy fucking data centers or whatever it is that America makes.
F-35s.
What you are?
F-35s.
Yes, sorry. F-35s and that sort of thing. And so he paused all of those, and everyone was like, all right, okay. And his biggest supporters were talking about 3D chess and how it's all part of his art of the deal or whatever it is that people associate with the Trump brand. But he said, but I'm ramping them on China because they fought back. So it was a real power play. It's like anyone who kowtowed, anyone who was obsequious, who was submissive, you're good, pat on the head. anyone who fought back, which was uniquely China,
penalized.
I think, you get penalised. So that was his big chest-beating alpha thing, which is obviously part of Trump's MO, isn't it? And then this week, he scrapped those. And he just
For
went
100 days, right? Suspended them.
90 day, yeah.
90 days.
Which is the same pause that he did on the other ones, obviously offset by the timing when he announced it.
Yeah.
So it's a 90-day pause, but it felt like, I mean, like, my headline was the Trump blinks. It felt like, for all his tough talk, he'd sort of gone, oh shit, because he had loads of people moaning about it, and it was obviously going to have a big macroeconomic effect on the US and an effect on US consumers, because, like it or not just US consumers, UK consumers, and most of the rest of the world, we're all quite dependent on imports from China because they're cheaper. And suddenly, if you're saying you can't have any more of these cheap Chinese imports, then your quality of life is going to diminish. So I think he's that, and a combination of other things like bond markets and all that sort of thing. He basically backed off. So I thought that was an interesting thing in terms of trade policy. And if anyone's got any thoughts about that, that's fine. And I stress, I'm not trying to have a go at Trump. I'm not one of these people that.
I'll go on.
Well, no, because I'm not one of these people. Trump elicits this disgust reflex in some people where they just fucking can't stand him. They can't even see his face.
I'm not asking to have a go at him personally.
Well, but I think sometimes what I try and do is critique his policies rather than the man.
Okay.
Back to the ad hominem thing. And I've always thought those tariffs were stupid. I'm trying to steel man his position, and I get his point. I think there are some areas in which other parts of the world have taken the piss, like the EU puts up large artificial barriers on the pretext of things like quality control or something like that, which means that most of the EU doesn't import American agricultural goods because they'll insist that there's somehow inferior quality or chlorinated chicken or whatever stuff that we've come up with.
So you're saying that it's not? That is, the quality is fine?
I don't know. I'm not expert enough to know, but I can see how, from Trump's point of view, it can feel like a sort of sneaky
Unfair
pretext.
playing field.
To keep American producers, mustn't confuse the two, American producers out of the European market. And other people, other markets do that. So I can see that he's got some grievance. I just think the way he went about it was
That's one area where I agree with tariffs.
Say it again?
That's one area where I agree with tariffs.
What's that? Elaborate.
Agricultural stuff.
Right. Why do you agree?
But I don't see why we should be buying American beef when there's lots of cows here and farmers face all these hurdles and unnecessary regulations that are imposed at government level.
Well, there we are. So
if you want to buy stuff from somewhere else, buy stuff that you can't get. That's why countries specialise in different things. The idea of America making printed circuit boards and low-cost components that they do in China is just silly. They don't have that industry, and you wouldn't want to do it. But why are we buying lamb from New Zealand when there's like more people, more sheep than people in? Well, why is it cheaper? It shouldn't be cheap. There's a problem then with your local industry, and it's often because of. So it's not tariffs, but it's the same thing that you face within a country. And that's the problem.
I thought you were heading there, and there I agree.
Africa. Like people flooding Africa with low-cost agricultural products that their own farms aren't competitive. That's why they would impose tariff barriers.
So there's two sides to the tariff thing there, and
but this is way off the topic of telecom.
It's fine. Well, this is the final segment.
I'm going to bring it back around.
He'll bring it. So I'll give you a chance in a sec, but the final segment is always where we're most self-indulgent anyway. Not least because that's when we're half pissed anyway. So from a libertarian point of view, from a free market absolutist point of view, I would like there to be no tariffs anywhere, and I would also like the bureaucratic levels to be really low. Yeah. So to your point about why we're buying New Zealand lamb rather than Welsh lamb or whatever, and you seem to be alluding to the fact that maybe we encumber the Welsh sheep farmers too much.
Well, I mean,
so I think the answer to that is to
have a shitty time of it.
Yeah, the answer to that is not tariffs. Is to encumber the domestic producers. The
less.
Yeah, in an ideal world, yes.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say. I mean, to me. My other passion besides like telecom policy and stuff is like history. I'm a big military history guy.
Right.
And I'm concerned. The tariffs to me, it's all tied in with this sort of rise of nationalism that we're seeing globally.
Yeah,
right.
It is.
it's a U.S. thing, it's a U.K. thing.
National
Brexit,
populism, like Reform Party here.
Germany, it's Austria. I mean, and China and Russia. I mean, you got and kind of tied in with populist leadership and da da da.
And you don't need to be you don't need to know too much history to know that excessive nationalism's not fucking great, is it?
Well, especially and then you throw in a trade war. You know, it's like this sounds a little familiar, and you got a lot of younger males who maybe not feeling like they've got a lot of economic opportunity.
So you stoke their resentment and all that.
I think, it's we should all be calm.
We should just take a
I feel
chill
like
pill.
a global citizen. I love traveling and I love being overseas, and I love being here. I love being everywhere. So I'm just concerned about things that are making people feel more like I need to identify as an American or a Brit or China.
Yeah,
and I've
completely.
got and I may have a lot of issues with the CCP, and I do, but I have a lot of really dear Chinese friends too. And I don't want to lose sight of that.
They're people too, man.
Exactly.
But that's the thing I don't like, and I've said it loads of times on the pod. What I don't like about it, and you're right, in terms of their policy, in terms of things like IP theft, in terms of currency manipulation, in terms of excessively favouring domestic industry and all that sort of thing. We know that in telecoms, it's pretty much just a two-way thing in terms of telecoms infrastructure in China of Huawei and ZTE. Hardly anyone else gets a look in, although I was surprised to see the other day Ericsson still gets a little bit of business there. So they do plenty of things that are worthy of critique, but
a little bit of business is a lot of money.
Well, quite. They've got a lot of scale there.
I can steelman Trump's position in telecom easily.
Go on.
Because the whole suspicion is, well, it's probably even more than suspicion, because Eva Du wrote about this quite a lot and there's been reporting on it. But Huawei's rise to stardom in Europe when it went around winning loads of 4G contracts and basically overtook Ericsson as the main provider of equipment to all these European operators, happened when they got this very generous loan from the Chinese, I can't remember the name of the bank, but one of the Chinese state banks, that was equal to something like twice its annual revenues at the time. I mean,
the Chinese not at all related to the government bank,
like
I think
a $200 billion loan. And they basically made it impossible with their pricing for people like other companies in the market at the time, which wasn't really Ericsson.
And not just their pricing, but their credit terms.
People like Nortel and those guys just couldn't compete. And then what happened is those guys ended up getting swallowed in rounds of consolidation. And if you look at those kinds of tactics, you go, well, that's not fair trade behaviour, is it?
No, it's not. Well, it's certainly not WTO.
And that's why someone might have tariffs, I guess.
Yeah, and you're not competing in a commercial open market term. You're competing really with the government at that point.
Yeah,
right? So
you are.
How are you going to do that?
Quite. And there I get it. To your point, I think you made a great point. You're saying that it's not a level playing field. We're democracies, we're free markets, we have certain rules about government intervention in the free market. And China doesn't, so it's not a level playing field. But worryingly, and I think maybe this feeds into a little bit what you were just saying a minute ago, Dave, you see a bit too much of the if you can't beat them, join them sort of thing. Of well, then let's try doing it their way. And that's not ideal, because there's reasons why we would rather live in America or the UK than China. Not that China isn't a beautiful, wonderful, diverse, historically amazing country, but we'd just rather not live under that more repressive regime.
Yeah.
So yes, I think all that's interesting, and I take your point about nationalism. There is a lot of it going on.
Well, it was where I was going to bring it back to telecoms is the letter that Ian was wrote about earlier with the we need 6 gigahertz or we're going to all die, and they at least twice in the letter they specifically called out, don't do what the U.S. stakeholders want, which is it's just playing into this
I know,
and I'm very concerned about that.
Part of that is feeding into the stuff that's come out of the Trump administration, like when J.D. Vance went over to that Munich Security Conference and sort of told off Europe. And there were parts of what he said where I really liked it, but it wasn't the most diplomatic thing ever.
The tone was maybe not quite on.
Yeah, and so it's got everyone's hackles up, and everyone's just like, a lot of the rhetoric is like, well, then fuck America, we'll go and do our own thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think from Europe, a lot of that's empty. They're like, well, we might even spend more than 2% of our GDP on defence or something like that, where America spends about double that. But it has created this sort of snowballing nationalistic thing that you're describing.
Yeah, and I'm just saying we need to think about where we're going, collectively, wherever you are, whatever nationality you are,
They'd be better off without the European Union. Then they'd all be worried about Germany invading them, and they'd spend much more on their national defence.
Well, actually,
That's
you
the
made
solution to the problem.
You wrote a piece which was very similar in tone to a piece we wrote. I'm not going to get into it now. I'm just for the sake of the headline. But you wrote a piece where your headline was "Vodafone forgets Europe isn't a country in latest moan," and we covered it. And it was a public letter from Vodafone about some kind of collective action on the part of Europe. And of course, it isn't a country. We're not the United States of Europe.
Well, yeah, we're not going to get into it.
Yeah. But I saw it's a funny headline. And I got one last thing before we call it a day. And this is more specifically directed at the US part of what we were just talking about, which is the piece I wrote this morning before coming in. The headline was, US says don't use Huawei AI chips or else. Now, this is a thing...
That's a shocker. They don't want you using those.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, the fact... So the point, and I'll lead up to it, the point I want to make is not that that's their policy, it's how they implement the policy that I critique the most strongly. So they had this thing, the Biden administration, you got this thing in the States, obviously, you're American, but you got this weird thing in the States between the general election and then the president coming to power, about 3 months, like November, December, January, where there's this weird sort of hybrid, is it only 2 months? Okay.
Yeah, lame dog, yeah.
Well, but also just like the people who've been voted out are still making policies.
Yeah, and they try to cram everything.
Yeah, and they cram everything in because they've got nothing to lose at that stage.
Everyone, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things they crammed in at the last minute was this thing called AI diffusion rule, which was actually incredibly... sometimes you get these bits of legislation and they're deliberately long because no one could be fucked to read through them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is about 200 pages of blah, 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 legalese, usual bollocks. And the essence of it is we're going to create, for the purpose of AI chips, we're going to create 3 countries. We're going to create the baddies. This is all paraphrasing, although it'd be so much more helpful if they got me in to write their fucking stuff.
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah,
the good,
more or
the bad,
less.
and the
Yeah, the good, bad, and the ugly.
Who's
So the bad... So the good is America and its closest chums, like the UK, Western Europe, all that sort of thing.
I'm not sure Western Europe's his closest chums anymore.
At the time it was.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's all relative, isn't it? The bad is the naughty step people, like China and Russia and North Korea and Iran and all that. And then the ugly, for the purpose of torturing your comparison, was this middle tier of people that basically weren't the good or the bad. So it's everyone else was the ugly.
Yeah, if you don't fall in either category, there you go.
And they had
Africa.
Yeah, well, just everyone else. Mate.
Okay.
And
that's basically Africa. That is everyone else.
No. The list of good was much smaller than you might imagine.
Okay.
Like, for example, Israel isn't in the good. And you would have thought Israel
would be in the good.
One of America's closest allies. Anyway.
They're running around cozying up to the Syrians and the Saudis at the moment, so that won't go down well.
We haven't got time for that tangent. And the ugly, the everyone else category basically had these caps imposed unilaterally by the US on them on how much AI shit they could buy and sell. And there was lots of complaints, not least from Nvidia, which obviously wanted to sell loads of AI shit to all these countries. And that
they don't care who they sell their stuff to, as long as they can sell it.
Well, fair enough. It's commerce.
Yeah. No, they shouldn't. I get it.
Yeah. And anyway, that was called the AI diffusion rule, and it just got rescinded today. But the funny thing about it, and I thought it was shit, and I wrote about it at the time saying it was shit. But the funny thing about it is they rescinded it, and they said we're going to come up with something that's better. I mean, there was a typical sort of Trumpy quote, but it's from, how all the people who are in the administration always try and sound a bit like him because there's such a sort of weird cult of personality around the bloke. So there's Undersecretary of Commerce for Industry and Security, Jeffrey Kessler.
I mean, they've all dumbed down.
I don't even think it's even dumbed down. It's just he's got a tone, hasn't he? He's got a certain mode of delivery. And they're all trying to ape it. I suppose the rhetoric is dumbed down. I'll feed into that.
It's like you watched that debate on TV between JFK and Nixon years ago, and the quality of debate on it compared to what happens nowadays.
Whereas Trump would just be cussing their haircut or
it's
something.
It's so pathetic. The
we actually
2020s.
discuss sexual policy.
I know, but it's effective in the internet age. Anyway, I'm not defending it. And he goes, the Trump administration will pursue, this is a quote, will pursue a bold, inclusive strategy to American AI technology with trusted foreign countries around the world, trusted obviously being the operative word there, while keeping the technology out of the hands of our adversaries, another word that's doing a lot of heavy lifting. At the same time, we reject the Biden administration's attempt to impose its own ill-conceived and counterproductive AI policies on the American people. So that's obviously a political statement. You know, they're separating themselves from the last lot. But then, they came out with some guidance. So they haven't actually formulated the policy yet. They had to rescind this other one because the deadline was, I think, tomorrow for it to go through. So at the 11th hour, they knocked it on the head. I think it was exactly 90 days again. The Americans seem to like increments of 90 days.
Yeah.
It was 90 days from when Biden came out with it in January the 15th. No, that's more than 90 days, isn't it? Anyway, we'll forget it. And one of the things they said, the BIS, which is a subset of the Department of Commerce, and this is a quote from them. They said they're issuing guidance that using Huawei Ascend chips anywhere in the world violates US export controls. So what they're basically saying is, if Huawei makes a chip and you use it, you've pissed off America. Whoever you are, it could be us in this room. I could have an Ascend chip in this Dell laptop I've got, and then
How could that be a violation of U.S. export law? Like if somebody in the U.K. imports a chip from China.
Quite. I mean, this is my grievance at it all. I think it's massive overreach. But their rationale is that there's the only way Huawei could have made these Ascend chips on like a 7-nanometer process or whatever is if they used US IP. And what they're saying is anything that even uses US intellectual property is subject to US direct control. So this has always been my biggest grievance about it. By all means, have export controls from your own country and inconvenience people like NVIDIA or Intel.
They use a middle country.
Well, exactly. Well, this is part of the game of whack-a-mole they've been trying to play. Is you know, they're trying to prevent the transfer of these chips into China, but they'll always find a way of going through third parties.
Yeah,
but let me quickly finish.
Very tenuous, isn't it?
Well, it is
China's
tenuous.
Give a shit about this anymore now, and
why would China give a shit about it?
They're saying you can't make your chips using this technology because it's American IP. Well, who are they expecting to pay fines or pay attention to this nowadays?
Well, so this is it. They're using up a lot of global political capital because they're basically saying any country that in any way
buys these chips,
is on our shit list,
right?
And what they haven't specified what they're going to do about it. But I think this is what I kind of want to wrap up on because I think we're on about 2 hours now. I think Pierre's like, damn right.
Yeah.
Is careful, or I won't let you take those sweets home. By the way, they were very nice. Those things you brought in. They're like posh dime bars for me.
Yeah.
I'll have one more before Pierre runs off.
Nixon. And then there was another thing from BIS that said it's issuing guidance warning the public about the potential consequences of allowing US AI chips to be used for the training and inference of Chinese AI models. And anyway, to wrap it up, to explain to you lot and the audience why I'm going on about this, I think for a while now, and this is actually predates Trump, the Biden administration was doing it, and Trump kicked it off in his first term. I think America's falling into the trap of what all powerful countries have done, and this is certainly true of the UK a couple of centuries ago, where they overestimate the utility and the effectiveness of their own power. Like I've just been watching, there's an interesting documentary on Netflix at the moment about the Vietnam War, and it's quite adversarial. It's quite a sort of, this is why the Vietnam War was shit. So, you know, they've got a distinct narrative, but, you know, I was reminded from it quite what a catastrophic ill-advised bit foreign adventure it was.
Yeah.
And America's been doing that sort of thing, and that started in the early 60s. And America's been doing that sort of thing ever since, and here we are 80 years later. And I just think it is the most powerful country in the world. It is the most influential country in the world. We joke about it sometimes in the pod. You hear some podcasts I listen to, like Joe Rogan or whatever, go, America's the greatest country in the history of the world. And it's like, well, maybe it is, although I just wonder who you're trying to convince when you say that. But I think that leads to hubris, and it leads to overreach.
Sure. Yeah, the sun never sets on the British Empire, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we were guilty of it a couple of hundred years ago, and other empires, we go all the way back to Rome or whatever.
Sure.
And that's my biggest critique of America, whether it's under Trump or whatever other president. It's just they're a bit hubristic. They think they can throw their way around. I say they. Well, I've got an American in the room, but I'm deliberately not saying you because I don't want to feel like this is directed at you individually. They feel they could throw their weight around, and they can a lot. But as we see from a lot of these military entanglements, it doesn't. Raw power doesn't always translate to successful outcome. And I suspect that some of this stuff, they're using up a lot of global political capital, trying to force everyone, the Europeans, their other allies, into going along with their thing. Look, here we are. Here's a great quote. Let me quickly say before you butt in.
About Trump and his
No, I'm talking about America, full stop, whether it's under Trump or Biden or whatever.
There's loads of Americans who don't like what Trump's doing at the moment.
No, I'm talking about the...
more than half the country against him.
I'm talking about...
He's the most...
the
administration of America, which is Trump's administration.
I know, but my only point is, thank you, Pierre, but my only point is it's not unique to Trump. It's been an ongoing thing, and you could call it fucking deep state or whatever if you want. But let me just give one quote which sums that up. But yes, obviously I'm not referring to America.
Let Dave say something.
No, I will. I won't end it there.
The American in the room.
I'm never so rude as to insist that I have the final word on the pod. But there's just one little quote from the end of this announcement that they gave today.
Yeah.
And it said, quote, "Direct actions ensure the United States will remain at the forefront of AI innovation and maintain global AI dominance." That's their quote from the piece. So they're not hiding it. They're basically saying, our policy is to remain dominant and we will do whatever it takes to remain dominant. And I just think that's hubristic. I think it's also futile. I think to a certain extent they're fighting against the current.
Yeah. I mean, weren't we going to stop Huawei from being able to manufacture these chips in the first place? And then everybody was like surprised when they came out with the Ascend, and everything. So, I mean, that obviously didn't work. I mean, I'm not a trade policy expert and I'm not an AI expert, so I won't pretend like I am. But to me, this all just circles right back to what we were talking about with nationalism. Like, so I mean, it's
totally.
America's going to dictate what the world should do. And I don't think that plays well.
I just don't think it's possible.
Well, and I don't think
to a certain extent, beyond the certain
right. I mean, sure, we have been at least, kind of the sole, global superpower, and China's ascending and but I mean, again, I'm a student of history. I look at what the British Empire did, sort of as it declined from being the global superpower, and there's good things and bad things to learn from those lessons.
Yes, exactly. And I think I speak, finally, unless you got any last thoughts, Ian, it's just overreach, really. It's not even a moral criticism, although I've got plenty of moral criticisms of it, like who the fuck do you think you are telling everyone else what to do? But I just don't think it's practical. I think they could be more subtle. Cool. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up there. It was great to see you, and thanks a lot for letting us know you were here. Yeah.
This is fun.
And if we can distract you from your fascinating Spectrum conference, by the way, I was only being half sarky, given that we've been talking about it for the last 2 hours.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of good stuff going on.
It'd be great if you join us at the pub. It's a nice day. We'll sit in the beer garden.
Thank you.
So this will probably come out tomorrow on a Thursday. And we're going to do another one on Friday. So lucky you get two for the price of one. Not that anyone pays us. What? Ian didn't even know he's coming on Friday. Okay, so I will wrap it up there and say thanks a lot for listening. Make sure you join us for that one.